Settle in and let your mind drift as we explore the quiet moments that changed everything. Tonight, we journey through history's most serendipitous discoveries where absent-minded mistakes, forgotten experiments, and pure chance gave humanity penicillin, microwaves, and post-it notes. These aren't stories of frantic eureka moments, but gentle tales of curiosity meeting coincidence. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let these soothing narratives of accidental brilliance carry you toward peaceful sleep. Remember to subscribe for more calming history stories to help you unwind each night. Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to his London laboratory on a mild September morning in 1928, his mind still lingering on the pleasant Scottish countryside he'd left behind. The air in St. Mary's Hospital was thick with the familiar scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of scientific work resuming after the summer break. Fleming had spent his holiday at his country home in Suffolk, enjoying a respite from the demanding work of bacteriology that consumed most of his waking hours. He was a methodical man, though not particularly tidy in his laboratory habits, a trait that would prove fortunate in ways he could never have imagined. As he climbed the stairs to his second-floor laboratory, Fleming was preparing to resume his research on Staphylococcus, the stubborn bacteria responsible for numerous infections that plagued hospitals and homes alike. Before leaving for vacation, he had been culturing these bacteria in petri dishes, studying their behavior and searching for weaknesses that might be exploited. In the rush to leave for his holiday, Fleming had stacked several of these culture plates on his laboratory bench rather than properly storing or disposing of them. It was a small oversight, the kind that happens in busy laboratories everywhere, the kind that usually amounts to nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But when Fleming returned to his bench and began examining the abandoned petri dishes, something caught his eye that made him pause. One particular plate looked different from the others. While most had grown the expected golden yellow colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria forming a thick carpet across the air surface, this one dish had an unwelcome visitor. A patch of mold had contaminated the culture, its fuzzy green-blue growth spreading across one section of the plate like an unwanted guest at a carefully planned party. For most researchers, this would have been an immediate signal to discard the ruined experiment and move on. Contamination was common, frustrating, and generally considered worthless. Fleming, however, possessed a quality that separated him from many of his contemporaries. He was deeply observant, with an almost meditative attention to detail that bordered on the contemplative. Rather than immediately throwing the contaminated dish into the disposal bin, he held it up to the light, streaming through his laboratory window, and looked more carefully. What he saw in that moment would ultimately save more lives than perhaps any other medical discovery in human history. Around the mold growth, there was a clear zone, a halo of emptiness where no bacteria grew. The Staphylococcus colonies that had flourished across the rest of the plate simply stopped at a certain distance from the mold, as if an invisible barrier had been erected. The bacteria nearest to the mold weren't just struggling, they were dead or dying, their colonies dissolving into transparency. Something about this fungal intruder was actively killing the bacteria, and doing so at a distance. The mold wasn't simply outcompeting the bacteria for nutrients, it was producing something that had antibacterial properties. Fleming's mind began working through the possibilities. He had spent years searching for substances that could kill bacteria without harming human tissue, a quest that had consumed much of his professional life. The existing antiseptics were brutal and indiscriminate, often damaging human cells as readily as they destroyed bacteria. They were useful for surface wounds but useless for internal infections, where they would cause more harm than good. The dream of finding a substance that could selectively target bacteria while leaving human tissue unharmed seemed perpetually out of reach. And yet here, in this contaminated dish he might easily have discarded without a second glance, was a hint that nature had already solved this problem. The mold itself wasn't particularly exotic. Fleming identified it as belonging to the genus Penicillium, a common type of fungus found on aging bread, rotting fruit, and damp walls. It was the same family of molds that gives blue cheese its distinctive appearance and flavor, an everyday organism so mundane that most people wouldn't give it a second thought. The spores had likely drifted in through an open window or door during the warm August days when the laboratory had sat empty, settling onto the uncovered petri dish in one of those random events that happen constantly in the world, almost always without consequence. Fleming carefully preserved the contaminated plate and began to investigate. He created a pure culture of the mold, growing it in isolation so he could study its properties more systematically. When he transferred liquid from this mold culture onto fresh plates of bacteria, the same thing happened. The bacteria died. He tested it against different types of bacteria and found that it was particularly effective against any of the most dangerous species, including those that caused pneumonia, scarlet fever, gonorrhea, meningitis, and diphtheria. The substance the mold was producing seemed to be a powerful antibacterial agent, and Fleming named it penicillin after the penicillium mold that produced it. What made this discovery particularly remarkable was its gentleness toward human tissue. When Fleming tested penicillin on white blood cells and other human cells, he found it had virtually no toxic effect. Here was a substance that could kill deadly bacteria while leaving human cells unharmed. The kind of selective weapon against infection that medicine had been seeking for decades. It was a key that fit only the bacterial lock, leaving everything else untouched. Fleming published his findings in 1929 in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology, describing his observations with characteristic understatement. The paper, titled On the Antibacterial Action of Cultures of a Penicillium, with special reference to their use in the isolation of B. influenzae, was met with polite but limited interest from the scientific community. The problem was that Fleming's penicillin was difficult to produce in quantity and proved unstable, losing its potency quickly. He lacked the resources and chemical expertise to purify and concentrate it into a form that could be used as a practical medicine. For more than a decade, penicillin remained a laboratory curiosity, a promising observation that seemed too difficult to translate into clinical reality. The story might have ended there, with Fleming's discovery slowly fading into obscurity, mentioned occasionally in scientific papers but never fulfilling its potential. But history had other plans. As the clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, the need for effective treatments for infected wounds became desperately urgent. In Oxford, a team of scientists led by Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain revisited Fleming's old papers and saw potential that others had overlooked. They developed methods to purify and mass-produce penicillin, transforming it from a laboratory curiosity into a miracle drug. By 1942, penicillin was being used to treat Allied soldiers, saving countless lives that would have been lost to infected wounds, pneumonia, and other bacterial infection. The survival rate for bacterial pneumonia jumped from 15% to over 85%. Soldiers who would have died from infected battlefield injuries survived and returned home. The impact was so profound that penicillin was called the drug that won the war, though its greatest contributions would come in the decade of peace that followed. In the years after World War II, penicillin and the antibiotics that followed revolutionized medicine. Diseases that had been death sentences became treatable inconveniences. Childbirth became dramatically safer as puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infection, became easily curable. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and countless other bacterial diseases lost much of their terror. Life expectancy in developed countries rose sharply, driven in significant part by the conquest of bacterial infection. Parents no longer had to watch helplessly as their children died from strep throat or ear infection. Surgery became vastly safer as post-operative infections could be prevented or treated. The antibiotic revolution that penicillin launched stands as one of the most significant advances in human health in all of history. Fleming himself always remained humble about his discovery, acknowledging the role that chance had played. He often said that he did not invent penicillin, nature did that. He merely discovered it. And even that discovery owed much to accident and observation rather than brilliant design. When he received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945, along with Florey and Chain, Fleming used his acceptance speech to warn about the dangers of antibiotic resistance, showing the same careful observation and foresight that had led to his discovery in the first place. The story of penicillin's discovery carries lessons that extend far beyond microbiology. It reminds us that breakthrough discoveries often come not from rigid adherence to plan but from remaining open to the unexpected, from being willing to investigate anomalies rather than dismiss them as inconveniences. Fleming's messy laboratory bench, which might have been criticized by a more fastidious supervisor, created the conditions for contamination that led to discovery. His curiosity about a ruined experiment, his willingness to look carefully at something that appeared to be merely a mistake, opened a door that rigid experimental protocols might have kept closed. There's something almost meditative in imagining that September morning in 1928, Fleming standing at his laboratory bench with the contaminate petri dish held up to the light, his mind quiet enough to truly see what was before him, rather than what he expected to see. In our modern world of carefully controlled experiments and rigorous protocols, we sometimes forget that nature still has lessons to teach us, if only we remain observant enough to notice when something unexpected happens. The greatest scientific discoveries often come not from forcing nature to answer our questions, but from listening carefully when nature volunteered information we didn't know we needed. Fleming's accidental discovery reminds us, too, of the interconnectedness of all things. A holiday in Scotland, an open window, a spore drifting on London air, an untidy laboratory bench, a curious mind. All these elements had to align in just the right way at just the right moment. Remove any single element, and the discovery might not have happened or might have been delayed by years or decades, with countless lives lost in the interim. It's a humbling thought, suggesting that some of our greatest achievements come not entirely through our own efforts but through our willingness to work with the accidents and opportunities that the universe presents today. When you take an antibiotic to treat an infection, when you undergo surgery without fear of deadly post-operative infection, when you watch a child recover quickly from an ear infection that might once have been fatal, you're benefiting from that moment of curiosity in a cluttered London laboratory. You're the beneficiary of Fleming's decision to look carefully at a contaminated petri dish instead of simply throwing it away. Sometimes the best discoveries really do happen when we forget to clean up, when we remain curious about our mistakes, when we're willing to see possibility in accidents. In the quiet space between expectation and observation, between plan and chance, between order and chaos, whole new worlds of possibility await those patient and curious enough to notice them. Percy Spencer stood in the Raytheon laboratory in 1945, surrounded by the humming machinery of post-war technological progress. The war had just ended, and the company was transitioning from wartime production to peacetime applications, trying to find new uses for the technologies that had helped win the conflict. Spencer, a self-taught engineer with an extraordinary intuitive grasp of electronics despite having no formal education beyond grammar school, was working with magnetrons, the powerful vacuum tubes that generated the microwave radiation essential to radar systems. These magnetrons had been crucial to the Allied victory, allowing radar systems to detect enemy aircraft and ships with unprecedented accuracy. Now, in the quiet of peacetime research, they sat in the laboratory waiting for someone to imagine their next purpose. On this particular day, Spencer was standing near an active magnetron, running tests and making adjustments, when he felt something unusual in his pocket. He reached down and discovered that the chocolate bar he had tucked away earlier had turned into a melted, gooey mess. For most people, this would have been nothing more than an annoying mishap, a ruined snack in a stained pocket, worthy perhaps of a moment's frustration before moving on with the day's work. But Percy Spencer was not most people. His mind, honed by years of practical problem-solving and an insatiable curiosity about how things worked, immediately began asking questions. Why had the chocolate melted? The laboratory wasn't particularly warm. He hadn't been sitting on it or holding it against anything hot. What could have caused this unexpected melting? Spencer's thoughts turned to the magnetron. He knew these devices generated electromagnetic radiation in the microwave frequency range, invisible waves of energy that had proven so useful for bouncing off distant objects and revealing their location. But could these microwaves also generate heat? It seemed possible. The chocolate had melted while he was standing near the active magnetron, and the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Rather than simply accepting this as an interesting oddity and returning to his assigned work, Spencer decided to investigate. This decision, this choice to follow his curiosity down an unexpected path, would ultimately change how billions of people around the world prepare their meals. The next morning, Spencer came to work with supplies for an experiment. He brought a bag of popcorn kernels, those hard, dense seeds that transformed into fluffy white clouds when heated. If microwaves could generate enough heat to melt chocolate, what would they do to popcorn? He placed the kernels near the magnetron and switched on the power. What happened next must have been both startling and delightful. The kernels began to heat up, and then, one by one, they started popping. The sound of popping corn filled the laboratory. That familiar rapid-fire percussion that usually signaled movie theaters and carnivals, now occurring in the midst of serious electronic equipment. The popcorn scattered across the laboratory floor and equipment, a mess that any fastidious supervisor might have frowned upon, but also proof that something remarkable was happening. The microwaves were indeed generating heat, and doing so in a way that could cook food. Spencer's mind raced with possibilities, but he needed to understand more about how this heating process worked. His next experiment would become legendary in the history of accidental discoveries, though it ended with more drama than he had anticipated. He decided to try heating an egg, placing it near the magnetron to see what would happen. He invited a colleague to watch this demonstration, perhaps sensing that something interesting was about to occur. As the magnetron hummed to life and the egg began to heat, Spencer and his colleague leaned in to observe more closely. This turned out to be a mistake. The egg, heating rapidly from the inside as the microwaves caused the water molecules within to vibrate furiously, built up tremendous pressure. Suddenly, it exploded, splattering both men with hot egg. Spencer's colleague was startled and probably annoyed, but Spencer himself was thrilled. The explosion told him something important about how microwaves heated food differently from conventional methods, penetrating into the interior and heating from within rather than simply applying heat to the outside surface. These informal experiments convinced Spencer that he had stumbled onto something with enormous practical potential. He understood that if microwaves could heat food so rapidly and efficiently, there might be a way to harness this phenomenon for cooking. The idea seemed almost absurd at first, radar technology being used to cook dinner, yet Spencer had seen enough in his unconventional career to know that the most important innovations often came from making unexpected connections, from seeing possibilities that others overlooked because they seemed too strange or impractical. Spencer brought his observations to Raytheon's executives, and the company decided to pursue the idea. They built the first microwave oven in 1946, a device they called the Red Orange. It was enormous, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing about 750 pounds. It required water cooling and cost about $5,000, equivalent to roughly $70,000 today. This was clearly not a device or home kitchens. The first Red Oranges were sold to restaurants, railroad companies, and ocean liners, places where rapid cooking of large quantities of food justified the enormous expense and size. A Red Orange could cook food in a fraction of the time required by conventional ovens, making it valuable in commercial settings despite its limitations. The early microwave ovens were crude and somewhat intimidating. They looked more like industrial equipment than kitchen appliances, all metal and utility with none of the friendly design language of consumer products. The microwaves they generated were powerful enough to cook food, but also potentially hazardous if not properly shielded. There were concerns about safety, about whether these devices might harm the people using them or somehow make the food dangerous to eat. These concerns weren't entirely unfounded. The magnetrons generated intense electromagnetic fields, and understand the proper safety measures required careful research and engineering. It would take years of development before microwave ovens would be safe, affordable, and compact enough for home use. Spencer himself continued to innovate, filing patents and refining the technology. He understood intuitively how to make the heating more even and efficient, how to design cavities that would distribute the microwaves effectively throughout the cooking chamber. His lack of formal education proved no obstacle. Indeed, his practical, hands-on approach to problem-solving, honed through years of working directly with electronic equipment, gave him insights that might have eluded someone trained to think in purely theoretical terms. He held over 300 patents by the end of his career, testament to a mind that never stopped asking questions and imagining possibility. It wasn't until the 1960s that microwave ovens began to shrink in size and price enough to appeal to home consumers. In 1967, Raytheon introduced the first countertop microwave oven, priced at just under $500, still expensive, but within reach of middle-class families. These new models were compact enough to fit on a kitchen counter and simple enough for anyone to use. As prices continued to fall through the 1970s and 1980s, microwave ovens became ubiquitous in American homes and eventually around the world. Today, they're so common that we barely think about them, just another appliance sitting on the counter ready to reheat leftovers or pop popcorn or defrost frozen food in minutes rather than hours. The transformation in how people prepare food has been profound. The microwave oven enabled entirely new patterns of eating and living. Frozen dinners, once a novelty, became a staple of busy households. People could heat meals in minutes without firing up a conventional oven, saving time and energy. The microwave made it possible to eat hot food without extensive preparation, changing the rhythm of family meals and making it easier for individuals to eat on their own schedules. For better or worse, it contributed to the decline of family dinners and the rise of individualized, on-demand eating. It also made certain conveniences possible that previous generations couldn't have imagined, like hot food available at any hour with minimal effort, or the ability to defrost frozen ingredients quickly enough to salvage a forgotten dinner plan. The science behind microwave cooking is elegant in its simplicity. Microwaves are electromagnetic waves with frequencies around 2.45 gigahertz, carefully chosen because water molecules vibrate in response to these frequencies. When microwaves pass through food, they cause the water molecules to rotate billions of times per second. This molecular rotation creates friction, and friction generates heat. The food heats from within, wherever water molecules are present, rather than relying on heat conducted from the outside and as conventional ovens do. This is why microwave ovens can cook food so much faster than conventional methods. And it's also why they work better on foods with high water content and poorly on foods that are very dry. Percy Spencer's discovery reminds us of the importance of maintaining a playful, experimental attitude even in serious technical work. His decision to bring popcorn to the laboratory, to deliberately make a mess with exploding eggs, showed a willingness to explore and test that went beyond the careful, controlled experiments typical of formal research. He was willing to look foolish, to pursue something that might have seemed frivolous, because his curiosity demanded answers. This playfulness, this willingness to experiment with chocolate bars and popcorn and eggs, led to an invention that would eventually be used billions of times every day around the world. There's also something noteworthy about Spencer's background. He was born into poverty in Maine, orphaned as a young child, and received almost no formal education. He left school at 12 to work in a mill, and later joined the Navy, where he learned about radio technology. He was entirely self-taught in electronics, learning through observation, experimentation, and an apparently limitless curiosity about how things worked. When he joined Raytheon, his lack of formal credentials didn't prevent him from becoming one of the company's most valuable engineers. The microwave oven stands as proof that breakthrough innovations can come from anywhere, from anyone curious and observant enough to notice when something unexpected happens and brave enough to investigate it. Spencer's story also illustrates how wartime technologies often find peaceful applications. The magnetron was developed to detect and target enemies, to make war more efficient and deadly. Yet in Spencer's hands, this instrument of war became a tool for everyday convenience, for heating coffee and cooking vegetables and making life a little easier for millions of people. The same electromagnetic radiant ion that once swept the skies looking for enemy aircraft now rotates water molecules in leftover pasta and frozen burritos. It's a reminder that technologies are morally neutral, their value determined entirely by how we choose to use them. The melted chocolate bar in Spencer's pocket was such a small thing, the kind of minor inconvenience that happens countless times every day to people around the world. We all experience these tiny anomalies, these moments when something happens that doesn't quite fit our expectation. Usually we dismiss them, too busy or too focused on our planned activities to pause and wonder why something unexpected occurred. Spencer's genius lay not in creating the magnetron or understanding microwave radiation, though he understood both deeply, but in noticing when something odd happened and caring enough to find out why. He cultivated what we might call a contemplative attention, an awareness that allowed him to perceive significance in small events that others might overlook. Imagine if Spencer had simply been annoyed by his melted chocolate and moved on with his day. Imagine if he had been too busy with assigned tasks to pursue what might have seemed like a trivial distraction. Imagine if his supervisors had forbidden him from wasting time with popcorn and eggs when he should have been working on radar systems. The microwave oven might never have been invented, or its invention might have been delayed by decades. How many meals would have taken longer to prepare? How much energy would have been wasted using conventional ovens for small heating tasks? How many opportunities for convenience and flexibility in eating would have been lost? Today, when you stand in front of your microwave oven, watching your food rotate on the glass plate, watching the timer count down, perhaps you can think of Percy Spencer and his melted chocolate bar. You can remember that this everyday convenience, this appliance you probably use without thinking, originated in a moment of curiosity, in one man's decision to investigate something that seemed odd rather than dismiss it as unimportant. The microwave oven reminds us that paying attention matters, that small observations can lead to large consequences, and that playful curiosity is not a distraction from serious work, but often the very source of the most important innovation. In a world that often demands rigid focus and planned outcomes, Spencer's story is a gentle reminder that some of the best discoveries come from following our curiosity wherever it leads, even if it means making a mess with exploding eggs in a serious laboratory. Charles Goodyear was a man possessed by an idea that seemed to border on obsession. For more than a decade, he had devoted himself entirely to solving what he called the India rubber problem, pursuing his goal with a single-minded determination that brought him to the edge of poverty, illness, and despair. Rubber, that fascinating substance harvested from tropical trees, had captured the imagination of inventors and entrepreneurs throughout the 1830s. It was waterproof, elastic, and seemingly full of commercial potential. Yet it had one fatal flaw that prevented it from becoming the revolutionary material everyone hoped it would be. In summer heat, rubber items became sticky and malformed, melting into shapeless masses. In winter cold, they turned brittle and cracked. A rubber raincoat that worked perfectly in spring would become unwearable sludge by July and frozen cardboard by January. Goodyear believed deeply that this problem could be solved, The rubber could be stabilized somehow, transformed into a material that would maintain its useful properties regardless of temperature. This conviction drove him forward even as his experiments consumed his family's resources and his own health. He tried mixing rubber with everything he could think of: magnesia, lime, nitric acid, turpentine, witch hazel. He boiled it, he dried it, he exposed it to sunlight and shade. Nothing worked. Each promising experiment would eventually fail, the rubber reverting to its unstable nature when exposed to heat or cold. His family lived in poverty while he pursued this seemingly impossible dream. He was imprisoned for debt multiple times. His children sometimes went hungry. Friends and family begged him to give up this futile quest and find more practical employment. But Goodyear could not let go of his vision. By 1839, Goodyear had been experimenting with sulfur as an additive to rubber. Sulfur seemed to reduce the stickiness somewhat, and he had been conducting various tests to understand its effects. His workshop, if it could be called that, was wherever he happened to be living at the moment, often a cramped room that served as both laboratory and living quarters for his struggling family. On a winter day in Woburn, Massachusetts, Goodyear was demonstrating his latest sulfur-treated rubber compound to visitors. The exact details of what happened next have been debated by historians, and Goodyear himself told slightly different versions of the story over the years, but the essential facts remain consistent. He was holding a piece of rubber mixed with sulfur, gesturing as he explained his work. When the material slipped from his hands, it fell onto the hot surface of a cast iron stove that was heating the room against the Massachusetts winter. Goodyear's first reaction was likely dismay. Another sample ruined, more precious materials wasted. He reached to retrieve it quickly, expecting to find a melted, ruined mess. Instead, he discovered something that made him stop and stare. The rubber hadn't melted where it had contacted the hot stove. It had charred slightly around the edges, but the material itself had transformed. It was still flexible, still elastic, but it had a different quality, a toughness and stability it had never possessed before. Even more remarkably, when he examined it more closely and subjected it to various tests, this transformed rubber maintained its properties in both heat and cold. Most people, having accidentally dropped something onto a hot stove, would have simply been relieved it wasn't completely destroyed and moved on. But Goodyear recognized that this accident revealed something profound, that he had done something to the mixture of rubber and sulfur, creating a chemical transformation that gave the material exactly the stability he had been seeking for years. His hands must have trembled as he held that piece of charred rubber, understanding that this random accident might be the answer to the question that had consumed his entire adult life. The discovery, however, was just the beginning of another long struggle. Goodyear knew what he had witnessed, but he didn't fully understand why it had happened or how to reproduce it reliably. He had no formal training in chemistry. He worked through intuition and endless experimentation, trying to determine the precise conditions needed to achieve this transformation consistently. How much sulfur was required? What temperature was necessary? How long should the heating continue? He conducted hundreds of experiments, varying the proportions and conditions, often working in poverty so extreme that he had to borrow money to buy the materials for his next test. The process Goodyear had accidentally discovered would later be called vulcanization, named after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and metalworking. What happened during vulcanization was a fundamental chemical transformation. The heat caused the sulfur to form cross-links between the long polymer chains of rubber molecules, creating a three-dimensional network that prevented the molecules from sliding past each other too easily. This cross-linking made the rubber stable across a wide range of temperatures. It could still flex and stretch, maintaining rubber's useful elasticity, but it wouldn't melt in heat or become brittle in cold. It was a perfect balance of flexibility and stability, exactly what Goodyear had been seeking. By 1844, Goodyear had refined his process enough to receive a patent. He called his invention simply improvement in India rubber fabrics. The patent description was detailed and technical, the result of years of careful experimentation following that initial accident. But even with a patent in hand, Goodyear struggled to profit from his invention. He was a better inventor than businessman, more interested in perfecting his process than in exploiting it commercially. He licensed his patent widely, often for modest fees, more concerned with seeing his invention used than with becoming wealthy. Unscrupulous manufacturers infringed on his patent constantly, and Goodyear spent much of his remaining years in expensive legal battles to protect his rights. The impact of vulcanized rubber on the world was nothing short of revolutionary, though Goodyear himself never lived to see the full scope of what he had made possible. In the decades following his discovery, vulcanized rubber became essential to industrial civilization. It was used for gaskets and seals, for waterproof clothing, for hoses and belts, for countless applications where a flexible, durable, weather-resistant material was needed. But the truly transformative application came in 1888, nearly 3 decades after Goodyear's death, when John Boyd Dunlop invented the pneumatic rubber tire. Vulcanized rubber made the tire possible, and the tire made practical automobiles possible, which in turn reshaped cities, economies, and entire ways of life. Today we live in a world literally built on vulcanized rubber. Every vehicle that moves on roads uses rubber tires, billions of them manufactured every year. The shoes on your feet likely have rubber soles, made possible by Goodyear's discovery. The gaskets that seal your refrigerator, the hoses in your washing machine, the conveyor belts, factories, the waterproof seals and countless pieces of equipment all depend on vulcanized rubber. Medical equipment, from simple rubber gloves to complex tubing and seals in life-saving devices, relies on this material. Sports equipment, children's toys, industrial machinery, electronic devices, all use vulcanized rubber in various forms. It's difficult to imagine modern life without it. The story of vulcanized rubber is in many ways a story about persistence meeting luck. Goodyear's years of dedicated experimentation created the conditions for discovery. He had already identified sulfur as a promising additive, already understood rubber's properties intimately through countless failed experiments. When the accident occurred, he was prepared to recognize its significance. Someone without his deep knowledge of rubber might have simply seen a piece of material accidentally dropped on a stove and retrieved before it was completely ruined. Goodyear saw the answer to years of questions, the solution to a problem he had sacrificed everything to solve. There's something poignant about Goodyear's story, a melancholy undertone to this tale of accidental discovery. He died in 1860. Deeply in debt despite holding the patent on one of the most important industrial processes of the age. He had spent his entire adult life in poverty, sacrificing his health and his family's comfort for an idea. The companies that grew wealthy from his invention, including the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company founded decades after his death and named in his honor, benefited from his work far more than he ever did. He died owing hundreds of thousands of dollars. A broken man in many respects, though one who had achieved his life's great goal. Yet there's also something admirable, almost heroic, in Goodyear's unwavering dedication to his vision. He believed that rubber could be stabilized, that the problem could be solved, even when everyone around him thought he was wasting his life on an impossible dream. He persisted through poverty, through imprisonment, through his family's suffering, through countless failures. And he was right. The problem could be solved. His faith in the possibility of discovery, his refusal to accept that something was impossible simply because no one had yet figured out how to do it, ultimately proved justified. The accidental nature of the discovery also tells us something important about the relationship between preparation and chance. Louis Pasteur famously said that fortune favors the prepared mind, and Goodyear's story illustrates this principle perfectly. The rubber falling on the stove was an accident, but Goodyear's ability to recognize the significance of what happened was no accident. It was the result of years of focused work, of understanding rubber's properties so thoroughly that he could immediately perceive when something different had occurred. A casual observer might have seen nothing remarkable. Goodyear, with his prepared mind, saw everything. The temperature of the stove mattered too, another element of chance that had to align perfectly. Too cool, and the chemical transformation wouldn't occur. Too hot, and the rubber would simply burn and be destroyed. The stove happened to be at approximately the right temperature for vulcanization, hot enough to initiate the cross-linking of polymer chains but not so hot as to destroy the material entirely. This Goldilocks condition, neither too hot nor too cold, was essential to the discovery. Had the accident occurred in summer when no stove was burning, or had the stove been blazing at a higher temperature, nothing useful would have resulted. We can imagine that winter day in Massachusetts, the cold seeping through the wall of Goodyear's modest dwelling, the stove radiating warmth into the room, Goodyear gesturing enthusiastic as he explained his latest experiments to visitors who probably doubted his eventual success. We can picture the rubber mixture slipping from his hands, that moment of dismay, then the dawning realization as he examined what the heat had done. In that moment, years of failure suddenly made sense. All the experiments, all the poverty and struggle, all the different additives and treatments he had tried had been building toward this understanding. The sulfur was necessary, but so was the heat. Temperature was the missing variable he hadn't properly controlled in his earlier experiments. Following the accident, Goodyear still had to work out the details. To transform a lucky observation into a reproducible industrial process. This required more years of experimentation, determining optimal temperature, timing, and sulfur concentrations for different applications. It required understanding how thickness affected the process, how different types of rubber responded, how to achieve consistent results in large-scale production. The accident showed the way, but walking that path still required immense effort and dedication. Charles Goodyear's discovery of vulcanization stands as one of those rare moments where human persistence and natural serendipity intersected perfectly. His years of struggle prepared him to recognize opportunity when it accidentally presented itself. His willingness to investigate an accident, to see potential in something that might have seemed merely fortunate rather than significant, transformed a moment of clumsiness into a world-changing discovery. Today, every time you drive on rubber tires, every time you wear shoes with rubber soles, every time you benefit from any of the countless applications of vulcanized rubber, you're connected to that winter day in 1839 when a piece of rubber fell onto a hot stove and changed the world. Spencer Silver stood in his laboratory at 3 million in 1968, staring at the results of his latest experiment with a mixture of frustration and puzzlement. He had been tasked with developing a super-strong adhesive, something that would bond materials together with unprecedented power. The adhesive he had just created did the exact opposite. It was perhaps the weakest glue anyone had ever deliberately synthesized. When he applied it to surfaces and tried to stick things together, they adhered, but only barely. A gentle pull was enough to separate them. You could stick a piece of paper to a wall and it would hold, but you could just as easily peel it off without leaving any residue or damaging either surface. By any conventional measure, this was a complete failure. Strong adhesives were valuable. Weak adhesives seem useless, but Silver, like many great scientists, possessed a quality that set him apart from researchers who simply follow protocols and meet specifications. He was curious about his failures, rather than simply discarding this inadequate adhesive and starting over with a different approach. He began to investigate why it behaved the way it did. What he discovered was fascinating from a chemical perspective. Even if it had no obvious practical application, the adhesive consisted of tiny acrylic spheres that would stick to surfaces but wouldn't dissolve or permanently bond. These microspheres created what Silver called a low-tack, reusable, pressure-sensitive adhesive. The technical description sounded almost impressive, but the practical reality remained. He had created glue that barely worked as glue. Silver was convinced that this unusual adhesive must be good for something. It had properties unlike any other adhesive on the market. It was reusable. It didn't leave residue. It held light objects but released them easily. Surely someone, somewhere, could find a use for such a material. He began what would become a years-long campaign to find an application for his weak glue. He gave seminars within 3 millions, demonstrating the adhesive's properties to anyone who would listen. He sent samples to various departments. He tried to generate enthusiasm for this solution that was searching desperately for a problem to solve. The response was almost universally underwhelming. Engineers and product developers would watch his demonstrations politely, acknowledge that the adhesive was indeed unusual, and then return to their work with products that had clear purposes and obvious markets. What would anyone do with glue that didn't really stick? The few applications people suggested were either impractical or already adequately served by existing products. Silver's weak adhesive became something of a running joke at 3 millions. The glue that wasn't a solution without a problem. But Silver refused to give up. He continued to believe that somehow this material would prove valuable. 5 years passed. The adhesive sat in 3 million's archives, occasionally mentioned in internal publications, a curiosity that demonstrated interest in chemistry but seemed destined to remain forever a laboratory oddity. Silver had moved on to other projects, though he never completely abandoned hope that someone would discover a use for his creation. Then, in 1974, a colleague named Art Fry attended one of Silver's seminars about the adhesive. Fry was a chemical engineer who sang in his church choir, and he had been struggling with a small but persistent annoyance in his personal life. Every Sunday, Fry would mark the hymns in his hymnal with small slips of paper so he could find them quickly during the service. This was a common practice, simple and practical. The problem was that the bookmarks wouldn't stay put. They would slip out as he carried the hymnal, or fall out when he opened the book, scattering across the pew or the floor in opportune moments during quiet parts of the service. He had tried various solutions: heavier paper, folded corners, multiple bookmarks to create friction. Nothing worked reliably. The bookmarks kept falling out, and Fry kept fumbling to find his place while the organ played and the congregation waited. As Fry sat in Silver's seminar, watching a demonstration of the weak adhesive, his mind made a connection. What if he used this barely sticky glue on his bookmarks? They would stick to the pages well enough to stay in place but could be removed without damaging the hymnal. It was such a simple idea, almost trivial, the kind of minor convenience that barely seemed worth the effort of development. But Fry recognized that this small annoyance he experienced was probably common. How many people used bookmarks in books, only to have them fall out? How many people wanted to mark pages temporarily without damaging them with permanent adhesive or bent corners? Fry began experimenting with Silver's adhesive, applying it to paper strips and testing them as bookmarks. They worked perfectly. The bookmarks stayed in place through normal handling but could be removed and repositioned without any difficulty. But as Fry worked with these adhesive bookmarks, he began to realize they could be more than just page markers. He started using them to leave notes for himself, little reminders stuck to documents or surfaces where he would see them. He would write a quick message, stick the note somewhere visible, and then remove it when the task was complete. No tape needed, no pins, no residue left behind. The more Fry used these adhesive notes, the more applications he discovered. He could stick a note to a document to draw attention to a specific section. He could leave messages for colleagues on their desks or doors. He could organize information by sticking notes to a wall and rearranging them as his thinking evolved. These weren't just better bookmarks. They were an entirely new way of handling temporary information, a tool for thinking and communicating that didn't quite exist in any other form. Index cards couldn't stick to things. Tape was permanent and messy. Pins required a bulletin board. These adhesive notes created possibilities that no existing product quite matched. Fry brought his idea to 3 million's management, and the company began developing what they initially called press and peel notes. The development process was more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Silver's adhesive worked, but manufacturing a product that applied it consistently to paper in a way that could be mass-produced efficiently required solving numerous technical problems. The adhesive had to be applied in just the right amount, distributed evenly, and allowed to dry properly. The paper had to be cut precisely. The notes had to be packaged in a way that prevented them from sticking to each other prematurely. Fry, working in his basement and in his spare time, developed a solution to one of the key manufacturing challenges. He created a process for applying the adhesive in a continuous strip along one edge of the paper, which made production much more feasible. His dedication to solving these practical problems, combined with Silver's original chemical innovation, gradually transformed the concept into a viable product. But even with the technical challenges solved, 3 million wasn't convinced the product would sell. The company conducted market research, and the results were discouraging. When asked if they would buy adhesive notes, most people said no. They didn't see the need. They already had ways of taking notes and marking pages. The product seemed like a solution to a problem they didn't have. Based on this market research, a more conventional company might have abandoned the project, but 3 million decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking people if they would buy the product, they gave people samples and asked them to use the notes for a few weeks, then report back. The results of this trial were dramatically different. Once people actually used the adhesive notes, they loved them. They found applications the product developers hadn't imagined. They used the notes for everything from reminder messages to complex project planning. They stuck notes on phones, computers, refrigerators, documents, wall, mirrors, anywhere they needed temporary information to be visible. People who had been given samples kept requesting more. The product had to be experienced to be understood. Its value could be adequately conveyed through description alone. 3 million launched Post-it notes in 1980, first in 4 cities at a trial run, and then nationally, after the trial proved successful. The product's name had changed from Press and Peel to the more memorable Post-it, and the signature yellow color had been chosen almost accidentally. The first batch of paper used in the trial run happened to be yellow because that was the scrap paper available in the lab. The color stuck because people associated it with the product. Today, that canary yellow has become iconic, instantly recognizable as the color of Post-it notes. The success was immediate and sustained. Within a year, Post-it notes had become one of 3 million's top-selling products. The simple adhesive notes found their way into offices, schools, and homes around the world. They changed how people organized information, how they communicated quick messages, how they brainstormed and planned. Design thinking and project management methodologies incorporated Post-it notes as essential tools. You could map out complex systems by writing ideas on individual notes and arranging them on a wall, easily moving them around as your understanding evolved. You could leave a quick message for a family member without needing to find paper and tape. You could mark important sections in documents without permanently defacing them. The story of Post-it notes has become a legend in business schools and innovation workshops, a perfect illustration of how breakthrough products can emerge from apparent failures. Spencer Silver's failed adhesive became the foundation of a billion-dollar product line, but only because he refused to dismiss his failure as simply worthless, and only because Art Fry connected Silver's solution to a problem he happened to experience in his own life. The invention required both the chemistry and the application, both the material innovation and the recognition of how that material could serve human needs. What makes this story particularly instructive is the long gap between Silver's discovery in 1968 and the product launch in 1980. 12 years elapsed between the creation of the adhesive and the successful commercialization of Post-it notes. During most of that time, the adhesive was considered a failed experiment, a chemical curiosity without practical value. Silver had to maintain faith in his creation for years without any validation, without any proof that his intuition about its potential value was correct. He had to continue promoting something that most people considered useless, risking his reputation and credibility within the company. Fry, too, showed remarkable persistence. Once he had the idea, he had to solve complex manufacturing problems, convince skeptical managers, and persist through discouraging market research. The path for Bookmark's solution to commercial product was long and uncertain. Fry led with moments when the easier choice would have been to abandon the project and work on something with more obvious potential. But Fry believed in what he had experienced using the notes himself. He knew they were valuable because they had made his own work-life better, more organized, more efficient. The initial market research failure is particularly telling. People couldn't imagine wanting post-it notes until they had used them. The product created a need that people didn't know they had. It wasn't solving an obvious, articulated problem, like I need a stronger adhesive or I need a faster computer. It was solving subtle inefficiencies and annoyances that people had learned to work around. Problems so small and so familiar that people didn't even recognize them as problems anymore. Bookmarks falling out, notes getting lost, information needing to be temporarily visible and then removed. These were such minor inconveniences that people had simply accepted them as part of life. This is one reason why true innovation is so difficult. The most transformative products often address needs that people don't realize they have until the product exists. Henry Ford supposedly said that if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Whether or not Ford actually said this, the principle holds true. People are remarkably good at articulating incremental improvements to existing solutions, but often struggle to imagine entirely new approaches to problems. They've already found ways to manage today. Post-it notes and their many imitators are so ubiquitous that it's hard to remember a time when they didn't exist. The sight of a computer monitor ringed with colorful sticky notes or a wall covered with them during a brainstorming session has become a visual shorthand for creative work and planning. The product has expanded far beyond the original yellow squares to include different sizes, colors, shapes, and specialized versions for specific uses. Digital versions attempt to recreate the experience, virtually a testament to how thoroughly the physical product has shaped how people think about organizing temporary information. Spencer Silver's weak glue, Art Fry's falling bookmarks, and the 12-year gap between problem and solution remind us that innovation is rarely straightforward. The path from discovery to application is often long, uncertain, and dependent on unlikely connections. Silver created a material without knowing what it was for. Fry had a problem without knowing a solution existed. The connection between them required chance, timing, communication, and the willingness of both men to believe in possibilities the others dismissed. It required a company willing to support projects even when market research suggested they would fail. It required actual human experience of the product to reveal its value. The next time you reach for a post-it note to jot down a quick reminder or mark a page or leave a message, you might think about that weak adhesive sitting unused in a laboratory for years. A solution patiently waiting for someone to discover what problem it could solve. You might think about Silver's persistence in promoting his failure, or Fry's falling bookmarks in church, or the 12 years between idea and product. Innovation, this story whispers, often looks like failure right up until the moment it becomes indispensable. Konstantin Fahlberg sat down to dinner one evening in 1879. Tired from a long day in the chemistry laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. He was a young researcher, recent immigrant from Russia, working under the renowned chemist Ari Remsen on the synthesis and characterization of coal tar derivatives. Coal tar, that thick black residue left over from coal processing, had become a treasure trove for 19th-century chemists. From this unpromising starting material, researchers were extracting and synthesizing an astonishing array of useful compounds, including dyes, pharmaceuticals, and other chemicals that were transforming industry and medicine. Fahlberg's work involved creating new derivatives of these coal tar compounds, carefully combining different chemicals, heating them, crystallizing them, analyzing their properties, documenting everything in meticulous detail. As Fahlberg reached for a piece of bread that evening, he noticed something extraordinary. The bread tasted intensely sweet, far sweeter than bread should taste. He took another bite. confused. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost cloying. He reached for another food on the table, and it too tasted remarkably sweet. Everything he touched to his lips had this same pronounced sweetness, as if someone had dusted everything with sugar. At first, he might have wondered if something was wrong with the food, if his wife had accidentally oversweetened the meal somehow. But as he continued eating, noting that every single thing tasted sweet, regardless of what it was supposed to taste like, he began to suspect the truth. The sweetness wasn't in the food, it was on his hands. In the rush to leave the laboratory that evening eager to get home for dinner, Thalberg had neglected to wash his hands properly. This was not uncommon in 19th century laboratories, where safety practices were far less rigorous than they would later become. Chemists routinely handled dangerous substances with minimal protection, tasted unknown compounds to help identify them, and worked in poorly ventilated spaces filled with toxic fumes. The cavalier attitude toward laboratory safety would seem shocking to modern scientists, but in Thalberg's time, it was simply how chemistry was done. The dangers were accepted as part of the profession, and researchers learned about toxicity through unfortunate experience, rather than through systematic safety protocols. Thalberg realized that he must have gotten something from the laboratory on his hands, and that substance was remarkably sweet. His scientific mind immediately began working through the possibilities. What had he been working with that day? Which compounds had he synthesized or handled? The sweetness was so intense that it couldn't be a natural sugar. This was something unusual, something potentially important. Rather than simply washing his hands and dismissing the incident as a minor curiosity, Thalberg decided to investigate. After dinner, he returned to the laboratory to retrace his steps and identify the source of this unexpected sweetness. What Thalberg did next would horrify any modern chemist and violates every contemporary safety protocol. He began systematically tasting the chemicals in his laboratory. He tasted the contents of beakers and flasks, touched his fingers to residues and then to his tongue, working backward through his day's experiments to find which compound was responsible for the sweetness. This was incredibly dangerous. Coal tar derivatives include numerous toxic, carcinogenic, and otherwise harmful substances. Thalberg was essentially playing Russian roulette with unknown chemicals, any one of which might have poisoned him, burned his mouth and throat, or caused serious harm. But in the context of his time, this wasn't seen as particularly reckless. Taste was a standard analytical tool in chemistry, used routinely to help identify unknown substances. Eventually, Thalberg found the source. He had been working on oxidizing toluenesulfonamide, a coal tar derivative, creating a compound that would later be named saccharin. When he tasted this particular compound, the intense sweetness flooded his mouth. The same overwhelming sweetness he had experienced at dinner. He had discovered it, the mystery ingredient that made everything taste sweet. But what exactly was it, and why was it so powerfully sweet? Thalberg set about analyzing the compound more carefully, determining its chemical structure, documenting its properties, understanding what he had created. Saccharin is a small organic molecule, about 300 times sweeter than sucrose, the common table sugar. It has no calories because the human body cannot metabolize it. We can taste its sweetness when it binds to sweet taste receptors on our tongues, but it passes through our digestive system without being broken down for energy. This combination of intense sweetness without calories would eventually make saccharin enormously valuable. But in 1879, no one was particularly looking for sugar substitutes. Sugar was affordable and plentiful. Dietary concerns about calorie intake were not yet the cultural force they would become. Thalberg had discovered something scientifically interesting, but its commercial potential wasn't immediately obvious. Thalberg and his supervisor Ira Remsen published their findings about this new compound in 1880, describing its synthesis and properties in the sober language of academic chemistry. The paper noted the compound's remarkable sweetness, but didn't particularly emphasize this property as anything more than a curious characteristic. To the academic chemist, saccharin was simply another coal tar derivative, one more addition to the growing catalog of synthetic organic compounds. The publication established their scientific priority in discovering and characterizing the substance, contributing to the advancement of chemical knowledge, but it didn't immediately suggest any particular application or commercial use. However, Thalberg, unlike his academic supervisor, recognized the commercial potential of what he had discovered. Over the next few years, he began developing methods to produce saccharin more efficiently and cheaply. He applied for patents on the manufacturing process, crucial with that including Remsen as a co-inventor. This decision would create lasting bitterness between the two men. Remsen felt that Thalberg had stolen credit for a discovery that had been made in Remsen's laboratory, using Remsen's resources and building on Remsen's research program. Thalberg argued that he had made the actual discovery, that his observation and follow-up investigation were the critical steps, and that he deserved to profit from his own work. The dispute between Thalberg and Remsen highlights an enduring tension in scientific research between academic knowledge creation and commercial application. Remsen was a pure scientist, interested in understanding chemistry for its own sake, publishing findings for the benefit of human knowledge. Thalberg was more entrepreneurial, seeing in their discovery an opportunity for commercial development and personal profit. Both perspectives had validity, but their different values and goals meant that what should have been a celebrated discovery became tangled in acrimony and competing claims. Thalberg established a factory in Germany to manufacture saccharin, and he began marketing it as a sugar substitute. The initial market was modest. In the late 19th century, most people had no particular reason to avoid sugar, but certain groups found saccharin valuable. Diabetics, who needed to restrict their sugar intake, could use saccharin to make their restricted diets more palatable. People with digestive problems that made sugar difficult to tolerate had an alternative. During times of sugar shortage or high prices, saccharin offered a cheap substitute. The product found its niche, and Thalberg became wealthy from his discovery, something that surely grated on Remsen, who received nothing beyond the academic credit. From their joint publication, saccharin's real moment came during World War I, when sugar became scarce and expensive due to wartime rationing and disrupted trade. Suddenly, an artificial sweetener that could replace sugar in foods and beverages became extremely valuable. Saccharin consumption increased dramatically during the war years and remained elevated afterward, as people had become accustomed to using it. The interwar period saw saccharin become increasingly common in processed foods and diet products. By World War II, it was again in high demand as sugar rationing returned, and saccharin became a familiar presence in households trying to stretch their sugar rations. The post-war decades brought increasing concern about weight, diet, and calories, creating a massive market for sugar substitutes. Saccharin became a key ingredient in diet sodas, sugar-free foods, and tabletop sweetener packets. The pink packets of Sweet and Low containing saccharin became ubiquitous in restaurants and homes. Diet soda became a huge industry, with saccharin allowing people to enjoy sweet beverages without the calories of sugar. The artificial sweetener that Thalberg had discovered through unwashed hands and dangerous tasting experiments became a multi-billion-dollar industry, fundamentally changing how people thought about sweetness and diet. However, saccharin's journey was not without controversy. In the 1970s, studies suggested that saccharin might cause bladder cancer in laboratory rats when consumed in massive quantities. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration moved to ban saccharin, creating public panic among diabetics and dieters who relied on it. The proposed ban sparked enormous public backlash. Congress received more mail about saccharin than about the Panama Canal Treaty being debated at the same time. People didn't want to lose their diet sodas and sugar-free foods. Eventually, Congress imposed a moratorium on the ban, requiring instead that product containing saccharin carry a warning label about potential cancer risks. Later research suggested that the mechanism by which saccharin caused cancer in rats didn't apply to humans, and concerns about its safety gradually diminished. The warning labels were eventually removed in 2000, and saccharin is now generally considered safe for human consumption in normal quantities. But the controversy illustrated how important artificial sweeteners had become to modern diets and food culture. People were willing to fight for their right to consume saccharin despite potential health risks, showing how thoroughly the substance had integrated into daily life. The story of saccharin's discovery illustrates several important themes about scientific accidents and innovation. First, the discovery depended entirely on Fallberg's failure to wash his hands, a lapse in hygiene that most people would consider unfortunate, but that in this case led to a world-changing discovery. Had Fallberg been more fastidious about laboratory safety and cleanliness, he would have washed away the saccharin before he could taste it, and the discovery might not have happened for years or decades. Second, the discovery required Fallberg to pay attention to something unexpected, and to investigate it rather than dismiss it. Many people might have noticed the strange sweetness, wondered about it briefly, and then moved on with their evening. Fallberg instead recognized it as significant and worth investigating. His decision to return to the laboratory and identify the source showed the kind of curiosity and persistence that characterizes successful scientists. Third, and most disturbingly to modern sensibilities, the discovery required Fallberg to taste unknown chemical, a practice that was dangerous then and would be absolutely forbidden now. We can acknowledge that his methodology led to an important discovery, while also recognizing that he was extraordinarily lucky not to have poisoned himself. Many other chemists of his era were less fortunate, suffering illness, injury, or death from exposure to the substances they studied. The history of chemistry includes numerous tragic stories of researchers harmed by the materials they worked with. Before modern safety protocols made laboratories much safer places, the commercialization of saccharin also tells us something about how scientific discoveries become integrated into everyday life. Fallberg's observation in 1879 didn't immediately change anything. It took years of development, patent applications, factory construction, and marketing before saccharin became available to consumers. It took specific historical circumstances, particularly the sugar shortages of 2 world wars, to create the market conditions where saccharin could flourish, and it took broader cultural changes around diet and weight consciousness to make artificial sweeteners truly ubiquitous. A scientific discovery is just the beginning. Transforming that discovery into something that affects millions of lives requires entrepreneurship, timing, cultural context, and sustained effort. Saccharin was also just the first of many artificial sweeteners. Its success proved that there was a market for sugar substitutes, encouraging researchers to develop alternatives like aspartame, sucralose, stevia-derived compounds, and others. Each new sweetener promised advantages over its predecessors: better taste, greater stability, fewer aftertastes, more natural origins. The competition between sweeteners has driven innovation and given consumer choices, but it all traces back to Fallberg's unwashed hands and his willingness to taste laboratory chemicals. Ira Remsen, for his part, never profited from saccharin despite his role in its discovery. He spent the rest of his career as a respected academic chemist, serving as president of Johns Hopkins University from 1901 to 1913. He made important contributions to chemistry but always felt that Fallberg had unfairly claimed credit and profit that should have been shared. The bitterness of their dispute serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of clear agreements regarding intellectual property and credit, especially in academic industry collaborations today. When you see those pink packets of Sweet and Low in a restaurant, or check the ingredients list on a diet soda and see saccharin listed, you're connected to that evening in 1879 when Constant and Fallberg sat down to dinner with unwashed hands and noticed that everything tasted impossibly sweet. You're connected to his decision to investigate rather than ignore this oddity, to his dangerous tasting of laboratory chemicals, to his recognition that this compound might have commercial value. The artificial sweetener industry, worth billions of dollars and affecting The diets of hundreds of millions of people began with a simple failure to wash up before dinner and a willingness to follow curiosity wherever it led, even if it meant tasting unknown compounds in a chemistry laboratory. It's a reminder that discoveries often come from unexpected places, that paying attention to anomaly matters, and that sometimes the most important findings emerge from moments of carelessness rather than careful planning. Wilhelm Röntgen worked late into the evening of November 8, 1895, alone in his laboratory at the University of Würzburg in Bavaria. He was 50 years old, a respected but not particularly famous physicist, known for careful, methodical work rather than dramatic breakthroughs. That evening, he was conducting experiments with cathode ray tubes, glass vacuum tubes that produced mysterious rays when electricity was passed through them. These cathode rays had fascinated physicists for years, and researchers across Europe were racing to understand their nature and properties. Röntgen had covered his cathode ray tube completely with black cardboard to block all light, ensuring that he could observe the faint glow of the cathode rays themselves without interference. The laboratory was dark, illuminated only by the eerie glow from the tube when it was activated. Röntgen had taken care to eliminate all other light sources, creating conditions where even faint luminescence would be visible. As he worked, adjusting his equipment and making observations, he noticed something that should not have been possible. Across the room, well away from his covered cathode ray tube, a small screen coated with barium platinosinide was glowing with a faint, shimmering light. This made no sense. The screen was designed to fluoresce when struck by certain types of radiation, but it was sitting far from the tube, and the tube itself was completely covered with cardboard that should block any light or cathode rays from escaping. Röntgen stared at the glowing screen, his mind working through the implication. Cathode rays could not travel more than a few centimeters through air. This was well established through previous experiments. The screen was meters away, far beyond the range of cathode rays, and even if cathode rays could somehow travel that far, they shouldn't be able to penetrate the black cardboard covering the tube. Yet the screen was definitely glowing, and it only glowed when the tube was activated. When he turned off the electrical current to the tube, the screen went dark. When he turned it back on, the screen glowed again. The correlation was unmistakable. Something was coming from the tube, passing through the cardboard, traveling across the room, and causing the fluorescent screen to light up. A less curious researcher might have assumed some flaw in the experimental setup, perhaps a gap in the cardboard covering that was allowing cathode rays to escape. But Röntgen was meticulous, and he trusted his preparations. He had covered the tube thoroughly. If something was getting through, it wasn't ordinary light or cathode rays as they were currently understood. It had to be something else, something unknown, some new type of ray with properties unlike anything previously documented. Röntgen's pulse must have quickened as he realized he might be observing something genuinely novel, a phenomenon that no one had seen before. He began experimenting systematically. With the careful methodology that characterized all his work, he placed various objects between the tube and the fluorescent screen to see what would block these mysterious rays. Paper didn't stop them. The rays passed straight through, and the screen continued to glow. Wood didn't stop them. Books didn't stop them. He held up his hand between the tube and the screen, expecting to see a show, and what he saw instead changed everything. On the fluorescent screen, he could see the shells of the bones inside his hand, skeletal structure clearly visible, surrounded by the dimmer shadow of his flesh. He was seeing inside his own body, witnessing the eternal structure of his living hand in a way that should have required dissection. Röntgen must have stood there transfixed, staring at this impossible image of his own skeleton. For all of human history, the interior of the living body had been hidden, knowable only through surgery or after death. Doctors diagnosed internal problems through symptoms, through pressing and listening, through educated guesswork. The bones, organs, and structures inside a living person were invisible, shrouded in flesh and skin. And now, through some accident of his experimental setup, Röntgen had found a way to see through that barrier. These mysterious rays could pass through soft tissue but were partially blocked by bone and metal, creating shadow images that revealed internal structure. For the next 7 weeks, Röntgen barely left his laboratory. He told no one about his discovery, not even his wife, working in obsessive secrecy to understand these rays and document their properties. He wasn't being paranoid, he was being careful, making absolutely certain that what he was observing was real and reproducible before announcing it to the world. He experimented with different materials, determining what the rays could penetrate and what would block them. He discovered that the rays could expose photographic plates, allowing permanent images to be captured. He took what would become the most famous X-ray image in history, a photograph of his wife, Anna Bertha's hand, showing her bones and the ring on her finger as stark shadows. When she saw the image, she reportedly said, "I have seen my death." Disturbed by this ghostly preview of her skeleton, Röntgen called his discovery X-rays, using the mathematical symbol for an unknown quantity. He didn't know what these rays were, how they were produced, or why they had the properties they did. He simply knew they existed and could be demonstrated. On December 28, 1895, less than 2 months after his initial observation, he submitted a paper titled "On a New Kind of Rays" to the Würzburg Physical Medical Society. The paper was careful, detailed, and conservative in its claims, describing the rays' properties without speculating too much about their nature. Along with the paper, Röntgen sent X-ray photographs to several prominent physicists, providing evidence that couldn't be dismissed as experimental error or misinterpretation. The response was explosive. News of Röntgen's discovery spread across Europe, and then the world with astonishing speed. Within weeks, newspapers were publishing accounts of these miraculous rays that could photograph bones inside living bodies. The public imagination was captured completely. This wasn't some abstract physics discovery relevant only to specialists. This was something anyone could understand and appreciate. You could take a picture of the inside of your body without surgery. You could see broken bones, swallowed objects, bullets lodged in flesh. The medical applications were immediately obvious and profound. Doctors and researchers rushed to replicate Röntgen's experiments. Within months, X-ray laboratories had sprung up across Europe and America. Physicians began using X-rays to diagnose fractures, locate foreign objects, and examine internal structures. The technology was crude by modern standards. Early X-ray images were often blurry and difficult to interpret, and the exposure times were long, requiring patience to remain perfectly still for minutes. But even these primitive X-rays provided information that had previously been impossible to obtain without surgery. A doctor could see a broken bone and understand exactly how it was fractured, allowing for better treatment. Surgeons could locate bullets and shrapnel before operating, making procedures faster and safer. The speed with which X-rays moved from laboratory curiosity to medical practice was unprecedented. In February 1896, just 3 months after Röntgen's announcement, X-rays were used in medical diagnosis in the United States. By the end of 1896, X-ray departments were being established in hospitals. A technology that didn't exist in October 1895 had become a standard medical tool within a year. This rapid adoption reflected both the obvious utility of X-rays and the relative simplicity of the equipment needed to produce them. Any laboratory with a cathode ray tube and photographic plates could make X-ray images. However, this rapid adoption came at a terrible cost. No one yet understood that X-rays were dangerous. The early X-ray pioneers, including technicians, researchers, and physicians, exposed themselves to massive doses of radiation without protection. They would hold X-ray tubes in their hands, test exposures on their own bodies, and work with the equipment for hours each day. Many developed radiation burns on their hands and faces, skin lesions that wouldn't heal, and eventually cancers. The histories of early radiology are filled with tragic stories of people who sacrificed their health, often unknowingly, to develop this new technology. One of the most heartbreaking figures was Clarence Daly, an assistant to Thomas Edison who worked extensively with X-rays in Edison's laboratory. Dali developed severe radiation injuries to his hands and arms, eventually requiring amputation of both arms. He died in 1904 from cancer caused by radiation exposure, one of the first known deaths attributable to X-ray exposure. His death and the mounting evidence of radiation injuries gradually led to the development of safety protocols, shielding, and limits on exposure. But the early years of X-ray technology were marked by a terrible innocence. Researchers handling these powerful rays casually as ordinary light, not realizing the harm they were causing themselves. Röntgen himself was more fortunate. He used X-rays carefully and sparingly, avoiding the massive exposures that harmed many of his contemporaries. He lived until 1923, dying at age 77 from intestinal cancer that may or may not have been related to his X-ray work. Unlike many scientists who discover something commercially valuable, Röntgen refused to patent his discovery or profit from it personally. He believed that X-rays should be freely available for the benefit of humanity, that such a powerful medical tool shouldn't be restricted by patents and licensing fees. He donated his Nobel Prize money to the University of Würzburg and lived modestly on his professor's salary. His ethical stance meant he died relatively poor, while others grew wealthy from X-ray-related patents and businesses. But he never expressed regret about his decision. The Nobel Prize itself was a testament to the importance of Röntgen's discovery. When the Nobel Prizes were first awarded in 1901, Röntgen received the inaugural Nobel Prize in Physics, the first person ever to receive this honor. The Nobel Committee recognized that X-rays represented a fundamental advance in physics and an enormous benefit to humanity. Few discoveries have had such immediate and obvious practical application. Röntgen's work opened entirely new fields of study, from radiology to crystallography to our modern understanding of electromagnetic radiation. The scientific understanding of X-rays evolved gradually after their discovery. Röntgen didn't know what X-rays were. He simply knew they existed and could document their properties. Later research revealed that X-rays are electromagnetic radiation, like visible light but with much shorter wavelengths and higher energy. They're produced when high-energy electrons strike a metal target, as happened in Röntgen's cathode ray tube. The fast-moving electrons collide with atoms in the target, and the sudden deceleration produces X-rays. This understanding allowed for the development of more efficient and controllable X-ray sources. Moving beyond the crude cathode ray tubes Röntgen had used, the medical applications of X-rays expanded far beyond simple bone imaging. Doctors learned to use contrast agents, substances that would show up clearly on X-rays, to visualize organs and blood vessels. Barium compounds could be swallowed to make the digestive system visible. Iodine-based compounds could be injected to highlight blood vessels and organs. These techniques transformed diagnosis, allowing doctors to detect tumors, blockages, malformations, and diseases without surgery. The chest X-ray became a routine medical test, helping diagnose pneumonia, tuberculosis, lung cancer, and heart problems. X-rays also revolutionized dentistry. Dental X-rays could reveal cavities, infections, and bone loss that weren't visible during examination, allowing for earlier intervention and better treatment. The characteristic images of teeth and jaw bones became standard parts of dental care. Today, getting dental X-rays is so routine that we barely think about it, but before Röntgen's discovery, dentists had to work almost entirely by feel and visible symptom, missing problems until they became serious. Beyond medicine, X-rays found application in security, quality control, scientific research, and art conservation. Airport security scanners use X-rays to see inside luggage. Manufacturers use X-rays to check for defects in metal parts and welds. Crystallographers use X-ray diffraction to determine the atomic structure of materials, work that led to the discovery of DNA's double helix structure. Art historians use X-rays to examine paintings, revealing underdrawings, alterations, and hidden layers that provide insights into artists' working methods. The technology has advanced enormously since Röntgen's time. Modern X-ray machines produce clearer images with far lower radiation doses. Digital X-rays have replaced photographic film, allowing instant viewing and easy storage. Computed tomography or CT scans use X-rays to create detailed three-dimensional images of the body's interior. Fluoroscopy provides real-time X-ray imaging, allowing doctors to watch the body's internal processes as they happen. All of this traces back to that November evening when Röntgen noticed a fluorescent screen glowing across his darkened laboratory. What makes Röntgen's discovery particularly remarkable is how close he came to missing it entirely. If he hadn't happened to have a fluorescent screen in his laboratory position where the X-rays could strike it, he would have had no way to detect the rays. If the laboratory hadn't been dark, he wouldn't have noticed the faint glow. If he had been less curious about why the screen was glowing, he might have dismissed it as some artifact of his equipment. The discovery depended on a precise alignment of circumstances and on Röntgen's willingness to investigate something unexpected rather than ignore it. Other researchers had almost certainly produced X-rays before Röntgen without realizing it. Cathode ray tubes were common in physics laboratories, and many are. Researchers were working with similar equipment. X-rays had probably been created hundreds of times in various experiments, but no one had noticed them or recognized their significance. Röntgen's contribution wasn't creating X-rays. It was recognizing that something unusual was happening and systematically investigating until he understood what he had found. The story of X-rays reminds us that some of the most important discoveries come not from seeking something specific but from paying careful attention to unexpected observation. Röntgen wasn't trying to discover a new type of radiation. He was studying cathode rays, continuing work that many others were doing. His discovery came from noticing something that didn't fit his expectations and being curious enough to investigate. In our modern era of targeted research, where scientists often know exactly what they're looking for and design experiments to find it, Röntgen's accidental discovery is a reminder that staying alert to the unexpected remains crucial today. Whenever you have a medical X-ray taken, whenever a dentist checks your teeth for cavities, whenever airport security scans your luggage, you're benefiting from Röntgen's observation of a glowing fluorescent screen in his darkened laboratory. That moment of curiosity, that decision to investigate why something was happening that shouldn't be possible, led to a technology that has saved countless lives, advanced human knowledge, and given us the ability to see which was previously invisible. Sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from finding what we're looking for but from noticing what we weren't expecting and having the wisdom to pay attention. Benedictus was working in his cluttered Parisian laboratory in 1903, surrounded by the glassware, chemicals, and instruments that filled every available surface. He was a man of varied talents and interests. Not just a chemist but also an artist, musician, and designer who moved fluidly between scientific and creative pursuits. His laboratory reflected this eclecticism, filled with experiments in various stages of completion, artwork in progress, and the general organized chaos of someone whose mind moved quickly from one idea to another. On this particular day, as he reached across his desk for something, his hand struck a glass flask perched on a high shelf. The flask tumbled from its position and fell toward the hard floor below. Benedictus braced himself for the inevitable crash and the tedious cleanup that would follow. Breaking glassware was an occupational hazard for chemists, an annoying but common occurrence that meant sweeping up dangerous shards and hoping none had scattered to places where they might later cut an unwary hand or foot. Glass vessels fell and shattered regularly in laboratories, part of the background noise of scientific work. He probably even winced slightly, anticipating the sharp sound of breaking glass and the glittering explosion of fragments across his laboratory floor. But the sound that reached his ears wasn't quite what he expected. The flask hit the floor with a solid thump, deafening the impact of breaking glass but without the characteristic scattering tinkle of fragments spreading across the floor. Benedictus looked down, puzzled. The flask had clearly broken. He could see the cracks, spiderwebbing across its surface, but it hadn't shattered. The pieces were all still holding together in roughly the original shape of the flask, as if some invisible force was keeping the fragments from flying apart. The glass had fractured but remained coherent, maintaining its form even though it was thoroughly broken. This was distinctly odd. Unlike anything Benedictus had seen before in his years of handling glassware, he picked up the cracked flask carefully, examining it more closely. The glass had definitely failed structurally. The cracks ran throughout the entire vessel. By all rights, it should have collapsed into separate pieces, or scattered into fragments, yet something was holding it together, keeping the broken shards in position. As Benedictus turned the flask in his hands, peering at it from different angles, in the laboratory light he noticed something coating the interior surface. There was a thin, clear film lining the inside of the flask. Barely visible but definitely present. His mind began working backward through his recent experiments, trying to remember what this particular flask had contained. And he recalled it. This flask had previously held a solution of cellulose nitrate, a liquid plastic that he had been working with for one of his many projects. After he had poured out the solution, he hadn't bothered to clean the flask immediately. The small amount of cellulose nitrate remaining inside had slowly evaporated, leaving behind a thin coating of plastic film adhering to the interior glass surface. This invisible coating, which he had completely forgotten about, had acted like an adhesive when the glass broke, holding the fragments together and preventing them from separating and scattering. The plastic film had effectively laminated the glass from the inside, creating a safety barrier that Benedictus had never intended to create. For most people, this would have been a lucky break, quite literally a happy accident. That meant less cleanup and no dangerous glass shards to sweep up. Benedictus might have simply been grateful for this fortunate circumstance, properly cleaned the flask this time, and moved on with his work. But Benedictus possessed the kind of mind that made connections others might miss, that saw potential applications in unexpected observation. His artistic background gave him a visual imagination that complemented his scientific training. He could picture possibilities, envision how this accidental property might be deliberately engineered for useful purposes. Even as he stood there holding the cracked but intact flask, Benedictus was already thinking about glass injuries and the dangers of shattering glass. France, like the rest of the industrializing world, was dealing with an increasing number of automobile accidents. Cars were becoming more common on French roads, and with them came a new type of injury that doctors were seeing with disturbing frequency. When automobiles crashed, the windshields would shatter, sending sharp glass fragments into the faces and bodies of drivers and passengers. These glass injuries were often devastating, causing cuts that left permanent scars, blindness from glass in the eyes, and sometimes fatal wounds from large shards penetrating vital areas. Benedictus had recently read newspaper accounts of a particularly horrific accident where a young woman had been severely injured by flying glass when her car collided with another vehicle. The image had stayed with him, the senseless tragedy of someone being maimed not by the impact of the crack itself, but by the sharp fragments of the very windshield that was supposed to protect her from the elements. As he held his accidentally laminated flask, the connection crystallized in his mind. What if automobile windshields could be made like this flask, constructed so that when they broke, the pieces would hold together rather than scatter into deadly projectiles? The idea seemed almost obvious once it had occurred to him. If a thin layer of plastic between two sheets of glass could prevent shattering, then deliberately manufactured laminated glass could save lives and prevent injuries in automobile accidents. The glass would still crack under impact, but it would crack safely, the fragment held in place by the plastic interlayer rather than flying free to cut and maim. Benedictus became consumed by this possibility, shifting his attention from whatever projects had previously occupied him to focus on developing practical laminated safety glass. The technical challenges were considerable. The accidental coating in his flask was rough and uneven, formed by random evaporation rather than careful application. To create effective safety glass, Benedictus needed to develop a method for applying a uniform layer of plastic between two sheets of glass, ensuring good adhesion without bubbles or gaps, and creating a product that would remain clear, intact over time, despite exposure to heat, cold, moisture, and sunlight. He experimented with different plastics, different thicknesses, different application methods. He tested his prototypes by dropping them, hitting them, subjecting them to temperature extremes, doing everything he could think of to ensure they would perform reliably in real-world conditions. By 1909, Benedictus had developed a practical manufacturing process and received a patent for what he called triplex glass. Named for its three-layer structure of plastic glass, he formed a company to manufacture and market this safety glass, convinced that automobile manufacturers would immediately recognize its value and rush to adopt it. After all, the safety benefits were obvious. Who wouldn't want windshields that didn't shatter into dangerous fragments? Surely the automobile industry would embrace this innovation that could save lives and prevent terrible injuries. But the automobile manufacturer's response was disappointing and frustrating. They acknowledged that laminated safety glass was technically superior to ordinary glass, but they balked at the increased cost. Triplex glass was significantly more expensive to produce than standard glass windshields, and the manufacturers didn't believe consumers would be willing to pay extra for this safety feature. Cars were still relatively new, and the industry was focused on making them more affordable, accessible, not on adding expensive safety features that would increase the purchase price. The manufacturer's attitude seemed to be that accidents were the driver's responsibility to avoid, and adding costly safety features wasn't their concern. This resistance to safety innovation seems shocking from our modern perspective, but it reflected the attitudes of the early automotive era. Safety regulations were minimal or non-existent. Cars were sold with features we would consider absurdly dangerous: no seat belts, no padded dashboard, brake systems that often failed, steering columns that would impale drivers in frontal crashes. The idea that manufacturers had a responsibility to build safety into their vehicles hadn't yet taken hold. Benedictus's safety glass was ahead of its time, a solution to a problem that society hadn't yet fully recognized as urgent. Ironically, the first major application of Benedictus's laminated glass wasn't in automobile at all, but in the lenses of gas masks during World War I. The military immediately recognized the value of glass that wouldn't shatter when struck by shrapnel or debris, protecting soldiers' eyes while still allowing them to see. Triplex glass lenses became standard in gas masks, finally giving Benedictus's invention a significant market. But this wasn't the application he had envisioned, and it must have been bittersweet to see his safety innovation being used in the context of war rather than civilian safety. Wasn't until the 1920s that automobile manufacturers began to slowly adopt laminated safety glass for windshields, and even then, adoption was gradual and reluctant. Some luxury car manufacturers offered it as an expensive option, marketing it as a premium feature for wealthy customers who could afford the best. Racing cars began using it after several high-profile accidents where drivers were seriously injured by flying glass. But standard passenger vehicles continued to use ordinary glass windshields well into the 1930s. Despite the mounting evidence that laminated glass could prevent injuries, the turning point came as governments began to regulate automobile safety. France, perhaps influenced by having a French inventor of safety glass, was M. Ong the first to require laminated windshields in new cars. Other countries gradually followed, though the process took decades. In the United States, laminated windshields didn't become mandatory until 1966, more than 60 years after Benedictus's discovery, when federal safety standards finally required them in all new passenger vehicles. The slow adoption meant that countless people were injured or killed by shattering glass in accidents that occurred during those intervening decades. Injuries that could have been prevented if Benedictus's invention had been embraced more quickly. Modern automotive safety glass has evolved far beyond Benedictus's original triplex design, but it still uses the same basic principle of lamination. Contemporary windshields typically use a layer of polyvinyl butyryl plastic sandwiched between two sheets of glass, create a laminate that's stronger, clearer, and more durable than Benedictus could have achieved with cellulose nitrate. When a modern windshield breaks, the glass fragments adhere to the plastic interlayer, creating a characteristic spiderweb pattern of cracks, while keeping the windshield intact and maintaining visibility. This allows drivers to continue seeing where they're going even after an impact rather than being suddenly blinded by a shattered windshield, and prevents the deadly shower of glass fragments that plagued early automobiles. Side and rear window. In modern cars use a different approach called tempered glass, OWEI. CH is heat-treated to make it much stronger than ordinary glass and designed to shatter into small, relatively harmless granules rather than large sharp shards when it breaks. This different approach is used because side windows need to be easily breakable for emergency escape, while windshields need to stay intact to protect occupants. But the fundamental insight that glass can be engineered to fail safely rather than catastrophically traces directly back to Benedictus and his accidentally coated flask. The applications of laminated safety glass extended far beyond automobiles. It's used in architectural applications for skylights and glass floors where falling glass could be dangerous. It's used in hurricane-resistant windows that need to withstand impacts from flying debris without shattering. It's used in aquarium viewing panels that must contain tremendous water pressure safely. It's used in bulletproof and blast-resistant glass for banks, embassies, and military applications, where multiple layers of glass and plastic create barriers that can stop bullets or absorb explosion forces. The aerospace industry uses laminated glass in aircraft windshields where failure at altitude would be catastrophic. Benedictus himself continued to work on improving his safety glass and exploring other inventions throughout his life, though none achieved the lasting impact of laminated glass. His artistic side also flourished. He was a successful painter and designed Art Deco patterns art textiles and wallpapers. He published books on design and decoration. His life exemplified the kind of creative polymathic intelligence that could move between art and science, seeing connections and possibilities that more narrowly focused specialists might miss. It was perhaps this breadth of interest and experience that allowed him to recognize the significance of his cracked flask and envision its life-saving applications. The story of safety glass is a reminder that accidental discoveries only matter if someone recognizes their importance and has the persistence to develop them into practical application. The flask could have simply been an amusing laboratory incident, a lucky accident that saved Benedictus some cleanup effort. Instead, it became the inspiration for a technology that has saved countless lives and prevented millions of injuries. But this transformation from accident to application required Benedictus to make the connection between his broken flask and automotive safety, to imagine how the accidental property could be deliberately engineered, and to persist through years of development and commercialization challenges. It's also a sobering reminder of how slowly important safety innovations can be adopted, even when their benefits are obvious. Benedictus offered the automobile industry a way to prevent terrible injury, backed by clear evidence that his laminated glass worked as promised. Yet the industry resisted for decades, prioritizing cost savings over human safety, only adopting the technology when forced by government regulations. This pattern has repeated throughout the history of automotive safety. From seat belts to airbags to electronic stability control, innovators develop life-saving technologies, and industries resist adopting them until regulation mandates it. Why? People continue to die from preventable causes today when you look through your car's windshield, when you walk beneath a glass skylight without fear, when you see glass doors and windows designed to fail safely if broken. You benefiting from Benedictus's observation of a falling flask in his Parisian laboratory, more than a century ago. That moment when he expected shattering glass and instead found cracked but coherent glass held together by forgotten plastic residue changed how we think about glass and safety. It's a gentle reminder that sometimes our mistakes and oversights, our failures to clean up properly or put things away correctly, can reveal possibilities we never would have discovered through careful planning. Innovation often comes not from doing everything right, but from paying attention when things go unexpectedly, watch carefully when something doesn't behave the way we expect, and having the imagination to see how an accident might become an opportunity. Roy Plunkett arrived at his laboratory at the DuPont Experimental Station in New Jersey on the morning of April 6, 1938, ready to continue his work on developing new refrigerants. He was only 27 years old, fresh out of graduate school at Ohio State University with a doctorate in chemistry, and this was his first major project at one of the world's premier chemical companies. DuPont had tasked him with finding alternatives to existing refrigerants, particularly sulfur dioxide and ammonia, which were effective at cooling but had serious drawbacks. Sulfur dioxide was toxic and corrosive. Ammonia was flammable and had a pungent odor. The company wanted something safer, more stable, and more pleasant to work with, refrigerants that wouldn't poison people if they leaked from home refrigerators or industrial cooling systems. Plunkett had been experimenting with various fluorinated hydrocarbons, carbon-based molecules where some, or all of the hydrogen atoms, were replaced with fluorine. These compounds showed promise as refrigerants because they were generally non-toxic, non-flammable, and chemically stable. One compound he was working with was tetrafluoroethylene, or TFA, a gas that he thought might have useful refrigerant properties. The previous day, he and his assistant Jack Reebok had prepared about 100 pounds of TFA gas and stored it in small pressurized cylinders, planning to use it for experiments. The cylinders were stored in dry ice to keep the gas cold and stable overnight. And this April morning, Plunkett retrieved one of the cylinders and connected it to his experimental apparatus, ready to run tests on the TFA gas. He opened the valve, expecting the familiar hiss of gas flowing from the pressurized cylinder into his equipment, but nothing happened. The valve was open. The pressure gauge on the cylinder indicated it should still be full, yet no gas was flowing out. This was puzzling. The cylinder clearly had pressure inside it. The gauge wasn't reading 0, but somehow the gas wasn't coming out when the valve was opened. Plunkett's first thought was probably that the valve was clogged or faulty. Gas cylinders occasionally developed problems with their valves, particularly when working with unusual or reactive gases. He disconnected the cylinder and shook it vigorously, thinking perhaps something was blocking the valve internally. Still nothing came out when he reopened it. He tried another cylinder from the same batch. This one worked perfectly, gas flowing normally as expected. So, the problem wasn't with his experimental setup, or some general issue with the TFA gas. Something had happened to this particular cylinder at this point. Many researchers might have simply set aside the problematic cylinder as defective and continued with their work, using the cylinders that functioned normally. After all, Plunkett had a project to complete. Experiments to run, results to generate. A single malfunctioning cylinder wasn't particularly important in the grand scheme of his research program, but Plunkett was curious, and more importantly, he was scientifically rigorous. He wanted to understand what had gone wrong. The cylinder registered pressure but wouldn't release gas. What could explain that? Where had the gas gone? Plunkett decided to investigate properly. He weighed the cylinder and discovered it was significantly heavier than it should have been if it were truly empty. The weight corresponded roughly to what a full cylinder should weigh, as if the TFA gas were still inside somehow. But if the gas was still there, why wasn't it coming out? Plunkett discussed the mystery with Jack Reebok, and together they decided to take the most direct approach to solving it. They would cut open the cylinder and see what was inside. Using a hacksaw, they carefully cut through the metal cylinder, a process that required care since they didn't know exactly what they might find inside. As the cut deepened and finally broke through, they discovered something completely unexpected. The interior of the cylinder was coated with a white, waxy powder. Where there should have been gaseous TFE under pressure, there was instead this solid substance, smooth and slippery to the touch, coating the inside of the cylinder like frost on a window pane. Plunkett scraped some of this material out and examined it more carefully. It was unlike anything he had seen before. The substance was extraordinarily slippery, more slippery than any material Plunkett had encountered. When he rubbed it between his fingers, it felt almost frictionless, as if coated with the finest lubricant. It was chemically inert, showy, and no reaction when exposed to acids, bases, or solvents that would normally attack or dissolve organic materials. It was stable at high temperatures, not melting or decomposing when heated. Most remarkably, when Plunkett and Reebok analyzed its chemical composition, they found it was made entirely of carbon and fluorine atoms in the same ratio as TFA gas. Somehow, the tetrafluoroethylene gas had spontaneously transformed into a solid polymer. What had happened inside that cylinder was a chemical reaction called polymerization, where small molecules linked together to form long chains or networks. The TFE gas molecules, each consisting of 2 carbon atoms and 4 fluorine atoms, had joined together to create long chains of repeating units, forming a polymer that Plunkett would later name polytrifluoroethylene, or PTFE. This polymerization had apparently been triggered by the specific conditions inside the cylinder, the pressure, the temperature, from the dry ice storage, and possibly trace amounts of iron from the cylinder walls acting as a catalyst. The reaction had consumed all the TFE gas, converting it into this solid, waxy polymer. Polymerization itself wasn't new in 1938. Chemists had been creating synthetic polymers for decades, developing materials like bakelite, nylon, and various synthetic rubbers. But PTFE was different. Its properties were extraordinary and unprecedented. The combination of extreme chemical resistance, exceptional slipperiness, stability at high temperatures, and electrical insulating properties made it unlike any existing polymer. Plunkett immediately recognized that he had discovered something potentially important, though exactly how important wouldn't become clear for years. The challenge now was to make more of this material deliberately and understand how to control its formation. Plunkett couldn't just wait for random polymerization in gas cylinders. He needed a reproducible process. He and his team at DuPont began systematically investigating the conditions that caused TFE to polymerize. They experimented with different pressures, temperatures, and catalysts, gradually working out methods to produce PTFE consistently and in larger quantities. This development work took years of effort, transforming an accidental discovery into a manufacturable material. DuPont recognized the potential value of PTFE and filed for patents, though initially the company wasn't sure exactly what to do with this strange new polymer. Its properties were remarkable, but it was difficult and expensive to produce. PTFE couldn't be melted and molded like most plastics because it had an extraordinarily high melting point and became too viscous to flow even when heated above that point. Traditional plastic manufacturing techniques didn't work. Engineers had to develop entirely new processing methods, using techniques borrowed from powder metallurgy, compressing PTFE powder and sintering it at high temperatures to create solid objects. The first major application for PTFE came during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project, the secret program to develop atomic bombs. Scientists working on uranium enrichment needed gaskets and seals that could withstand the incredibly corrosive uranium hexafluoride gas used in the separation process. Every material they tried was attacked and destroyed by this aggressive chemical. Then someone tried PTFE, and it worked. The polymer's exceptional chemical resistance meant it could contain uranium hexafluoride without degrading. PTFE became a classified military material essential to the atomic bomb program, though the scientists and engineers using it during the war had no idea it would later become famous as a coating for frying pans. After the war ended, DuPont began exploring civilian applications for PTFE. which they had trademarked as Teflon. The material's unique properties suggested numerous possibilities. Its chemical resistance made it valuable for laboratory equipment, industrial process involving corrosive chemicals, and applications where contamination had to be avoided. Its electrical properties made it useful for insulating wires and cables, particularly in aerospace and military applications where reliability was critical. Its high-temperature stability meant it could be used in situations where other plastics would melt or decompose. The application that would make Teflon a household name came in 1954 when a French engineer named Marc Grégoire, at his wife's suggestion, experimented with coating aluminum cookware with Teflon. Grégoire had been using Teflon to coat fishing tackle to prevent tangling, and his wife Colette wondered if the same non-stick coating might work on cooking pans. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. The extraordinary slipperiness that made PTFE so interesting to chemists would make it perfect for cookware. Food wouldn't stick to a Teflon-coated pan, making cooking easier and cleaner simpler. Grégoire developed a process for bonding Teflon to aluminum cookware, and founded a company called Tefal to manufacture non-stick pans. The product was introduced in France in 1956 and became an immediate success. French cooks loved the convenience of pans where omelettes slid out effortlessly, where delicate fish fillet didn't stick and tear, where cleanup required just a quick wipe rather than vigorous scrubbing. The non-stick cookware concept spread rapidly to other countries, and by the 1960s, Teflon-coated pans had become common in kitchens worldwide. The success of Teflon cookware transformed how people thought about cooking. Non-stick surfaces enabled low-fat cooking since food could be prepared without oil or butter to prevent sticking. They made cooking more forgiving for inexperienced cooks who might otherwise burn or stick their food. They reduced cleanup time and effort, making cooking more convenient for busy households. The distinctive sight of eggs sliding around in a Teflon pan became iconic, featured in countless advertisements and cooking demonstrations. However, Teflon cookware also raised questions and concerns over the years. The coating could be scratched or damaged by metal utensils, and there were worries about what happened if the coating was ingested or if the pans were overheated. When heated above about 500 degrees Fahrenheit, Teflon begins to break down and can release fumes that are harmful to birds and potentially irritating to humans. These concerns led to recommendations about proper use, avoiding metal utensils that could scratch the coating, not heating empty pans, ensuring adequate ventilation, and replacing pans when the coating became significantly damaged. More serious concerns emerged about PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, a chemical that was used in the manufacturing process for Teflon and other fluoropolymers. PFOA was found to persist in the environment and in human blood, and studies suggested possible health effects. This led to significant changes in how Teflon and similar materials were manufactured, with companies developing PFOA-free production processes. Modern Teflon cookware is made without PFOA, though the historical contamination and the broader category of PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, remain environmental and health concerns that continue to be studied and addressed. Beyond cookware, Teflon found applications in an astonishing variety of fields. It's used in medical devices, from catheters to surgical implants, taking advantage of its biocompatibility and the fact that tissues don't adhere to it. It's used in the aerospace industry for wiring insulation and seals that must function in extreme conditions. It's used in chemical processing plants for gaskets, hoses, and reactor linings that must resist corrosive chemicals. It's used in architecture for weather-resistant fabric roofs and facades, including famous structures like the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome and many airport terminals. The automotive industry uses Teflon in numerous applications, from fuel system components that resist corrosion to windshield wiper blades that glide smoothly across glass. The textile industry creates stain-resistant and waterproof fabrics by treating them with Teflon, or related fluoropolymers. Electronics manufacturers use Teflon for insulating high-frequency cables because of its excellent electrical properties. Even the semiconductor industry uses Teflon in manufacturing equipment because it won't contaminate. The ultra-pure materials needed for computer chips. Roy Plunkett, for his part, continued working at DuPont throughout his career, contributing to numerous other projects and receiving many patents, though none would achieve the fame of his accidental discovery of Teflon. He was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 1985 and received various honors, recognizing his contribution to chemistry and materials science. He lived to see his accidental discovery become a ubiquitous material used in millions of homes and countless industries worldwide. He died in 1994 at the age of 83, having witnessed Teflon, a remarkable journey from laboratory curiosity to household staple. The story of Teflon's discovery illustrates the unpredictable nature of scientific research and the importance of investigating anomalies rather than dismissing them. Plunkett could have simply discarded the malfunctioning cylinder and continued his refrigerant research. After all, he was supposed to be developing new refrigerants, not discovering new polymers. The cylinder that wouldn't release gas was a distraction from his assigned project, a problem rather than an opportunity. But Plunkett's curiosity and scientific rigor led him to investigate, to saw open that cylinder and examine what was inside, to analyze the unexpected white powder and understand what had happened. His willingness to pursue this tangent, to set aside his planned experiments and explore unexpected results, led to the discovery of one of the 20th century's most versatile and valuable materials. It's a reminder that breakthrough discoveries often come not from following the planned research path, but from having the curiosity and courage to explore the unexpected detours that appear along the way. The refrigerants Plunkett was originally hired to develop have largely been replaced by other compounds in modern times, but Teflon remains still valuable and widely used more than 85 years after the April morning when a gas cylinder mysteriously refused to flow and a young chemist decided to find out why. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg stood in the kitchen of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, confronting a problem that seemed minor in the grand scheme of his ambitious health reform program. He and his younger brother, Keith Kellogg, have been experimenting with creating wholesome, nutritious foods for the sanitarium's patients, people who came seeking treatment for various ailments and hoping to improve their health through the facility's regime of hydrotherapy, exercise, and carefully controlled diet. The Kellogg brothers were devoted to the principles of vegetarianism and whole-grain nutrition at a time when the American diet was heavy with meat, refined flour, and rich foods that John Harvey believed were contributing to poor health and moral decline. The sanitarium, which John Harvey had transformed from a small health resort into a renowned wellness destination, attracted wealthy and influential guests from across America. These patients expected nutritious meals, but they also expected food that was palatable and interesting. John Harvey was constantly experimenting with new food preparations, trying to create dishes that would be bought healthful according to his strict nutritional principle, and appealing enough that patients would actually eat them. He believed firmly that whole grains were essential to health, but whole grain foods in the 1890s were often unpalatable, heavy and dense, difficult to chew and digest, nothing like the refined white bread that most Americans preferred. On this particular day, in 1894, the Kellogg brothers faced the consequences of a mistake in their food preparation timing. They had cooked a batch of wheat, boiling it until it was soft, as part of their experiments to create a digestible bread alternative. The plan had been to process this cooked wheat while it was still fresh and pliable. But something had interrupted their work. Perhaps an emergency at the sanitarium demanded John Harvey's attention as chief physician, or perhaps they simply misjudged their schedule. Whatever the reason, the cooked wheat sat out much longer than intended, exposed to air, slowly losing moisture, becoming stale and unpleasantly dried out. When the brothers returned to their food experiments and discard the abandoned wheat, their first instinct might well have been to discard it and start over with a fresh batch. Stale cooked grain was hardly promising material for creating appealing food products, but the Kellogg brothers were operating on a tight budget. Despite the sanitarium's success, ingredients couldn't be wasted casually. More importantly, both brothers possessed a quality that would prove crucial to their accidental discovery. They were willing to experiment with apparent failures rather than simply discarding them. They decided to proceed with their planned process despite the wheat's condition, curious to see what would happen. The next step in their experimental process was to run the cooked wheat through rollers, pressing it flat. With fresh, properly moistened wheat, this process would create a dough that could be baked into a bread-like product. But when they fed the stale wheat through the rollers, something entirely different happened. Instead of forming a cohesive dough, the wheat broke apart into individual flakes. Each grain of wheat, dehydrated and somewhat hardened by its unexpected drying period, flattened into a separate thin flake, rather than merging with its neighbors into a continuous sheet. The result looked nothing like bread dough. It looked more like thin, crispy scales or flakes scattered across the work surface. The brothers stared at this unexpected result. They had been trying to make bread, or at least something bread adjacent, and instead they had created something that looked almost like large, irregular snowflakes made of wheat. The practical thing to do would still have been to throw this batch away and start over properly. But John Harvey, ever the experimenter, decided to bake these flakes anyway, just to see what would happen. When the flakes emerged from the oven, they had transformed into crispy, crunchy morsels, golden brown and appealing in appearance, completely unlike the heavy, dense whole grain foods the brothers had been producing. They tasted their accidental creation. The flavor was nutty and pleasant, the texture satisfyingly crispy, a dramatic contrast to the usual heavy texture of whole grain preparation. More importantly, these flakes seemed like they might actually be something the sanitarium patients would enjoy eating. The Kellogg brothers had been searching for ways to make whole grains more appealing. Here, through accident and their willingness to proceed with a mistake, they had stumbled onto something genuinely novel and potentially valuable. The brothers began serving these wheat flakes to sanitarium patients, and the response was enthusiastic. Patients who had been dutifully eating the sanitarium's nutritious but often uninspiring food found these crispy flakes to be a welcome change. They could be served with milk, making them soft and easily digestible, or eaten dry for a satisfying crunch. They were convenient, requiring no cooking or complex preparation. They stayed fresh for a reasonable time when stored properly. The flakes seemed to have stumbled upon that elusive combination of healthful and enjoyable that John Harvey had been seeking. Recognizing that had discovered something worth pursuing, the Kellogg brothers began refining their accidental process into a deliberate manufacturing technique. They experimented with controlling the moisture content of the cooked grain before rolling with different grains with various cooking times and temperatures. They tried different grains beyond wheat, including oats, rice, and corn. It was corn that would ultimately prove most successful, creating flakes with superior flavor and texture. The corn flakes had a lighter, more delicate character than the wheat flakes, with a sweeter, more appealing taste that required less added flavoring to make them palatable. As the brothers perfected their corn flakes recipe, they began to diverge in their visions for what to do with this discovery. John Harvey saw the flakes primarily as a health food for sanitarium patients and perhaps for sale through health reform channels to people committed to nutritional improvement. His interest was in promoting health and advancing his dietary principles, not in building a commercial food empire. Will Keith, on the other hand, recognized the enormous commercial potential. He understood that these corn flakes could appeal far beyond the narrow market of health seekers. These crispy flakes could become a mainstream breakfast food, a convenient and enjoyable alternative to the hot cereals and heavy breakfasts that dominated American morning meals. The tension between the brothers grew as Will pushed for commercial development and John Harvey resisted, wanting to maintain control and ensure the product remained true to health reform principles. Will believed that to reach a mass market, the cornflakes needed to be made more appealing, perhaps with added sugar or other flavoring that would attract regular consumers, not just health enthusiasts. John Harvey opposed such modifications, seeing them as compromising the nutritional integrity of the product. This fundamental disagreement about purpose and approach would eventually lead to a bitter split between the brothers. In 1906, Keith Kellogg founded the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flake Company, separate from the Sanitarium, to manufacture and market corn flakes commercially. He added sugar to the recipe, making the flakes sweeter and more appealing to mainstream American tastes. Exactly the kind of modification John Harvey had opposed. Will prove to be a brilliant businessman and marketer, understanding that success required not just a good product, effective promotion and distribution. He invested heavily in advertising, making Kellogg's Corn Flakes one of the most advertised products in America. He emphasized convenience, freshness, and taste in his marketing, appealing to busy housewives looking for quick breakfast options. The timing of Will's commercial venture was fortuitous. The early 20th century saw dramatic changes in American eating habits and food production. Urbanization meant more people were buying rather than growing their food. Women were beginning to work outside the home and wanted convenient meal options. Refrigeration and improved distribution networks made it possible to ship packaged foods across the country. The pure food movement had created consumer awareness about food quality and hygiene. Into this environment, Kellogg's Corn Flakes arrived as a modern, convenient, hygienic, ready-to-eat breakfast food. Packaged attractively and promoted aggressively, the success was phenomenal. Within a few years, Kellogg's Corn Flakes had become a household name across America. Will Kellogg became enormously wealthy, building a food industry empire that would eventually include numerous cereal varieties and other products. The company's success inspired countless imitators and competitors, turning Battle Creek, Michigan into the breakfast cereal capital of America. Companies like Post, founded by a former sanitarium patient, and dozens of smaller operations rushed to create their own versions of flaked cereal, creating an entire new food industry almost overnight. John Harvey Kellogg watched his brother's commercial success with mixed feelings. He continued running the sanitarium and promoting his health principles, but the corn flakes he had helped create accidentally were now associated more with Will's commercial enterprise than with health reform. The brothers' relationship became strained and eventually hostile, marked by legal battles over the use of the Kellogg name and competing claims about who deserved credit for the invention. John Harvey felt that Will had stolen his idea and corrupted it with added sugar and commercial excess. Will felt that John Harvey had failed to recognize the potential of their discovery and that his own business acumen had made Corn Flakes successful. The legal dispute between the brothers dragged on for years, with arguments about patents, trademarks, and who had the right to use the Kellogg name on cereal products. Eventually, Will largely prevailed, securing the rights to market Kellogg's Corn Flakes commercially, while John Harvey retained some rights to sell similar products through health reform channels. But the relationship between the brothers never recovered from the breach caused by their divergent visions for their accidental discovery. The transformation of breakfast eating habits that Corn Flakes helped catalyze was profound and lasting. Before ready-to-eat serious American breakfast was typically a hot, heavy meal requiring significant preparation time. Porridge or hot cereal cooked on the stove, eggs, meat, potatoes, biscuits, or bread. Breakfast preparation was labor-intensive, and eating breakfast was time-consuming. Corn Flakes and the ready-to-eat cereals that followed changed this entirely. Breakfast could now be quick and convenient, poured from a box and served with milk, requiring no cooking and minimal cleanup. This convenience appealed especially to urban families, where both time and kitchen space were limited, where women were increasingly working outside the home, and where the leisurely breakfast of earlier eras was becoming impractical. Ready-to-eat cereals fit perfectly into the accelerating pace of 20th century life. They were marketed as modern, scientific, hygienic, and wholesome, embodying the progressive values of the era. The bright packaging, the printed health claims, The convenience and consistency represented a new way of thinking about food and eating. The breakfast cereal industry that grew from the Kellogg brothers' accidental discovery became one of the most successful and enduring sectors of American food manufacturing. By the mid-20th century, breakfast cereal was a staple in American households, with entire supermarket aisles devoted to dozens of varieties. Companies competed through advertising, particularly through children's television programming, creating iconic mascots and memorable jingles that became embedded in American popular culture. Breakfast cereal became associated with childhood, with Saturday morning cartoons, with toys, prizes in the box. Evolving far beyond the health food origins John Harvey Kellogg had envisioned, the nutritional value of commercial breakfast cereals became increasingly questionable as companies added more sugar, artificial colors, and flavors to appeal to children. Many cereals bore little resemblance to the simple flaked grains that had emerged from the Kellogg brothers' kitchen. This would surely have horrified John Harvey, who had spent his life promoting nutritional reform and who had accidentally created the flake process while trying to make wholesome whole grain foods more palatable. His accidental discovery had spawned an industry that often prioritized taste and marketability over the nutritional principles he had valued. Yet even as sugary children's cereal dominated the market, there remained a segment of consumers interested in the kind of whole grain, minimally processed cereals closer to what John Harvey had originally envisioned. Health-focused cereal brands emerged, marketing themselves as alternatives to sugar-laden conventional cereals, coming full circle to the health reform origins of the flaked cereal concept. In recent decades, concerns about sugar, processing, and nutrition have led to renewed interest in simpler, more wholesome breakfast options, vindicating some of John Harvey's original nutritional philosophy, even as the industry built on his discovery often ignored those principles. The story of corn flakes reminds us that major innovations can emerge from mundane mistakes and that the same discovery can lead in vastly different directions depending on who controls it and what values guide its development. The stale wheat that the Kellogg brothers could easily have discarded became the foundation of an entire industry, but only because they were curious enough to proceed with their experiment despite the apparent failure, creative enough to recognize that the unexpected flakes might be valuable rather than worthless, and persistent enough to refine the accidental process into a reproducible technique. The divergent path of the two brothers after their discovery illustrates an enduring tension between idealistic and commercial motivations, between pursuing a vision for its own sake and pursuing market success. John Harvey remained true to his health reform principles but reached a limited audience. Will compromised some of those principles but created a product that changed American eating habits and reached millions of people. Neither approach was simply right or wrong. They represented different values and different definitions of success. Today, when you pour corn flakes into a bowl for breakfast, you're connected to that day in 1894 when cooked wheat sat out too long in a Battle Creek sanitarium kitchen, when two brothers decided to process that stale grain anyway, when accident and curiosity combined to create something entirely new. You're also connected to the complex legacy of that discovery, the convenience and consistency of modern processed foods, the tension between nutrition and taste, the transformation of eating habits, and the enduring question of whether food innovations should serve health or pleasure or somehow both. In the crispy crunch of those golden flakes lies more than a century of food history, industrial development, and cultural change, all stemming from a simple decision not to throw away a batch of stale wheat. Wilson Greatbatch sat at his workbench in a small workshop behind his barn in rural western New York, surrounded by the electronic components and tools of his trade. It was 1956, and Greatbatch was working as an assistant professor and researcher, but his real passion lay in this workshop where he could tinker with circuits and pursue his own ideas. He was building an oscillator, a device designed to record the sounds of the human heart. The project had grown from conversations with two surgeons at the University of Buffalo who had described the challenges of diagnosing certain heart conditions. They needed better tools to monitor and record heart rhythms, and Greatbatch who had a knack for solving practical problems with electronic solutions, thought he could help. The circuit he was building was relatively straightforward, at least in concept. It needed to amplify the faint electrical signals produced by the heartbeat and convert them into a form that could be recorded. Great Batch had sketched out the design, calculated the component values, and gathered the parts he needed from his well-stocked collection of resistors, capacitors, transistors, and other electronic components. These components were organized in his toolbox, sorted by type and value, though perhaps not as meticulously as they might have been. In the world of electronics, component values matter enormously. A resistor controls how much electrical current flows through a circuit, and using the wrong value can completely change how a circuit behaves. As Great Batch assembled his circuit, soldering component onto a board according to his design, he reached his box for a resistor. He needed a 10,000 ohm resistor for this particular position in the circuit, a component that would help set the timing characteristics of the oscillator. Without looking as carefully as he should have, he grabbed what he thought was the correct resistor and soldered it into place. It was an easy mistake to make. Resistors are small, cylindrical components marked with colored bands that indicate their value. And in a box full of similar-looking parts, it's remarkably easy to pick up the wrong one, especially if you're working quickly or if the light isn't perfect. When Great Batch finished assembling the circuit and connected power to test it, something unexpected happened. Instead of producing a continuous oscillation suitable for recording heart sounds, the circuit began pulsing. It would emit a brief burst of electrical current, then pause, then pulse again, over and over in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The pulse lasted about 1.8 milliseconds, followed by a pause of roughly 1 second, then another pulse. Great Batch stared at his circuit, initially puzzled and probably frustrated. This wasn't what he had designed. This wasn't what he needed for recording heart sounds. The circuit was clearly malfunctioning, but as Great Batch listened to the rhythm of the pulses and thought about what he was hearing, something clicked in his mind. The rhythm was regular and steady, about 60 pulses per minute. It sounded like a heartbeat. More precisely, it sounded like the kind of artificial electrical stimulus that might be used to trigger a heartbeat. Great Batch's mind raced back to those conversations with the surgeons, to things he had heard about heart block and cardiac arrest, about patients whose hearts failed to beat with the proper rhythm or sometimes stopped beating altogether. What if this malfunctioning circuit wasn't a failure at all? What if it was actually the solution to a different, far more important problem? Great Batch knew that the human heart's rhythm is controlled by electrical impulses generated by a natural pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, a small cluster of cells in the right atrium. In healthy hearts, this biological pacemaker sends regular electrical signals that trigger the heart muscle to contract in a coordinated rhythm, pumping blood efficiently throughout the body. But in some people, this natural pacemaker fails, or the electrical pathways that carry its signals become blocked. When this happens, the heart may beat too slowly, irregularly, or stop entirely, starving the body of oxygen and causing fainting, weakness, or death. Doctors in the 1950s had been experimenting with external electrical pacemakers, bulky devices the size of television sets that could deliver electrical pulses through wires inserted into the patient's heart. These external pacemakers could keep patients alive, but they were cumbersome, confining patients to hospital beds, and they carried risks of infection where the wires entered the body. The idea of a pacemaker was sound, but the existing implementations were far from ideal. What was needed was something smaller, something that could be implanted inside the patient's body, something reliable and long-lasting that would give patients freedom and mobility rather than chaining them to hospital equipment. As Great Batch examined his accidentally created pulsing circuit, he realized he might be holding the key to an implantable pacemaker. His circuit was small, far smaller than existing external pacemakers. It ran on batteries, requiring no external power source. It produced pulses at a regular, controllable rate that could be adjusted by changing component values, and most importantly, it had happened, almost by accident, through grabbing the wrong resistor. Instead of the 10,000 ohm resistor he had intended to use, Great Batch had installed a 1 megohm resistor, a component with 100 times more resistance. This dramatic difference in value had completely changed the circuit's behavior, transforming it from an oscillator into a pulse generator. Great Batch immediately set aside his original project and began work on developing this accidental circuit into a practical pacemaker. He understood that the path from a working circuit on a breadboard to an implantable medical device would be long and challenging, but he was convinced the goal was achievable and enormously important. He began by miniaturizing the circuit, making it small enough to implant in the human body. In the 1950s, before integrated circuits and modern microelectronics, this meant carefully selecting the smallest available discrete components and arranging them efficiently. He experimented with different battery technologies, looking for power sources that would be small, reliable, long-lasting enough to run the pacemaker for years inside the body. He tested various materials for encapsulating the electronics, seeking something that would protect the circuit from body fluids while being biocompatible and not causing adverse reactions in living tissue. He refined the circuit design, adding features that would make it safer and more reliable, ensuring that it would fail in a safe manner if something went wrong rather than potentially harming the patient. The technical challenges were substantial, but Great Batch was well suited to overcome them. He had studied electrical engineering at Cornell University, served in the Navy during World War II, worked on communication systems, and had years of experience designing and building electronic devices. More importantly, he had the determination and vision to persist through the inevitable setbacks and frustrations of developing something entirely new. He worked obsessively, often late into the night in his barn workshop, driven by the conviction that his accidental discovery could save lives. By 1958, Great Batch had developed a prototype pacemaker small enough to be implanted in a dog. The device was roughly the size of a small matchbox, containing the pulse-generating circuit, batteries, and output electronics, all sealed in an epoxy resin case. Working with surgeon William Chardak and physiologist Andrew Gage at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Buffalo, Great Batch tested his pacemaker in animal studies. The results were encouraging. The device could reliably pace the hearts of test animals, maintaining steady rhythms and functioning for weeks or months without failure. Next step was human trials, and in 1960 the team implanted one of Great Batch's pacemakers in a human patient for the first time. The patient was a 77-year-old man with complete heart block, a condition where the electrical signal couldn't travel from the upper to the lower chambers of his heart, leaving his heart beating dangerously slowly. The implantation was successful, and the pacemaker began immediately, pacing the patient's heart at a steady 60 beats per minute. For the first time, this man, who had been weak and often near collapse, had a strong, regular heartbeat. He could walk without fainting, could exert himself without his heart failing to keep up. The pacemaker gave him not just extended life but quality of life, freedom from the constant fear that his heart might simply stop. That implanted pacemaker functioned for 18 months before its battery finally depleted, far exceeding the team's initial expectation. By the time it needed replacement, the concept had proven itself. Other patients had received Great Batch pacemakers, and the results were consistently positive. News of these miraculous devices spread through the medical community. Here was a solution for heart block and other cardiac rhythm disorders. A solution that didn't confine patients to hospital beds, that could be implanted in a relatively simple surgical procedure, that gave people their lives back. Great Batch obtained patents on his pacemaker design and began working with medical device companies to manufacture the devices commercially. He founded his own company, Great Batch Enterprises, which became a major supplier of batteries and components for implantable medical devices. The pacemaker industry grew rapidly through the 1960s and beyond, with constant refinements and improvements. Devices became smaller, batteries lasted longer, and new features were added. Pacemakers learned to sense the heart's natural rhythm and only pace when needed, rather than pacing constantly. They became programmable, allowing doctors to adjust settings without surgery. Eventually, They incorporated sophisticated electronics that could respond to the body's needs, increasing pacing rate during exercise and decreasing it during rest. The impact on patients' lives was transformative. Before implantable pacemakers, people with severe heart block faced constant risk of sudden death, limited physical capabilities, and often shortened lifespans. After pacemakers became available, these same patients could live essentially normal lives, working, exercising, traveling, doing all the things that healthy people take for granted. By the end of the 20th century, millions of people worldwide were living with implanted pacemakers, each one a descendant of the circuit that Great Batch had accidentally created by grabbing the wrong resistor. The technology continued to evolve in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1956. Modern pacemakers are marvels of miniaturization, smaller than a coin, powered by batteries that last a decade or more. They contain sophisticated computer processors that monitor the heart continuously and adjust pacing in response to the body's needs. They can store data about the heart's performance and wirelessly transmit that data to doctors for remote monitoring. Some modern cardiac devices combine pacing with defibrillation, able to detect and correct life-threatening arrhythmias by delivering carefully calibrated electrical shocks. The evolution from Great Batch's first crude device to today's smart, adaptive cardiac devices represent decades of engineering refinement, but all of it traces back to that accidental wrong resistor. Great Batch himself became a prolific inventor, holding more than 325 patents over his career, many related to medical devices and battery technology. But he always considered the pacemaker his most important contribution. He understood that he had stumbled onto something profound through what was essentially a mistake. A moment of inattention that led to using the wrong component. In interviews later in life, he often reflected on the role of accident and chance in his discovery, acknowledging that he had been extraordinarily fortunate to make that particular mistake at that particular time, when he had the knowledge and resources to recognize its significance and develop it into something useful. There's something almost mystical about the chain of events that led to the implantable pacemaker. If Great Batch had been more organized, if his resistors had been sorted and labeled, if he had looked more carefully before grabbing that component, he would have built exactly the circuit he intended, a useful but not revolutionary device for recording heart sounds. The wrong resistor would have remained in his toolbox, and the pacemaker circuit might not have been discovered for years, during which time countless people with heart block would have died or lived severely limited lives. The accident had to happen to someone with the right combination of knowledge, creativity, and determination to recognize the significance and pursue the application. The story also illustrates the importance of intellectual cross-pollination, of people from different fields talking to each other and sharing problems. Great Batch's conversations with surgeons about cardiac monitoring planted the seed that allowed him to recognize the significance of his accidental pulse generator. Without understanding the medical need, without knowing about heart block and the limitations of existing pacemakers, he might have simply corrected his mistake and moved on. The accidental discovery was necessary but not sufficient. It also required context and application, a problem waiting to be solved, and someone who understood both the problem and the potential solution. Wilson Great Batch lived to age 92. Passing away in 2011, long enough to see his invention save and improve millions of lives. He received numerous honors, including induction into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, but he reportedly remained humble about his achievement, always acknowledging the role that accident had played alongside his own efforts. In his autobiography, he wrote about the spiritual aspect of invention, suggesting that he felt guided to make that particular mistake at that particular time, as if forces beyond his understanding had conspired to bring the pacemaker into existence when it was most needed. Today, when someone with a pacemaker goes about their daily life, their heart beating steadily and reliably thanks to a small device implanted beneath their skin, they are connected to that moment in 1956 when Wilson Great Batch reached into his toolbox and grabbed the wrong resistor. They're alive and active because a mistake happened, because someone paid attention to what the mistake revealed rather than simply correcting it and moving on, because curiosity and medical need align to transform an accidental circuit into a life-saving device. In the steady pulse of millions of hearts kept beating by pacemakers, we hear an echo of that first unexpected rhythm from Great Batch's workbench, a reminder that sometimes our most important discoveries come not from perfect execution but from fortunate accidents and the wisdom to recognize opportunity disguised as error. Rest easy knowing that some of humanity's greatest achievements came not from rigid planning, but from gentle curiosity, open minds, and the willingness to see possibility in mistakes. Sweet dreams.